passing motorist, likely getting the shock of his life. A discovery that led to this large police presence on the Southern State Parkway. All they know is that someone was driving by when something in the woods caught his eye.
Ruiz said he and his friends were brought to the park by Escobar to smoke pot. But when they got there, about a dozen MS-13 gang members appeared and ordered everyone onto the ground. Ruiz ran for his life. His 4 friends were murdered. Prosecutors say Ruiz pretended to be part of MS-13 in social media posts, which the gang sees as a sign of disrespect punishable by death.
It's the late night of April 12, 2017. Police in Islip, Long Island, responded to a call of human remains off the road in a wooded area behind a park in central Islip, a neighborhood of New York City that in recent years had become the battleground to a brutal street takeover by Mara Salvatrucha, or MS-13, a Salvadoran street gang formed in Los Angeles decades prior. Since 2010, the gang had begun stamping a presence on the rough neighborhood of Central Islip, a majority Hispanic community of about 35,000 residents in the area. Police approached the bodies to see the scene of 4 men, all murdered with an array of blunt and sharp weapons, beaten indiscriminately and brutally. Unfortunately, this was no unordinary scene in Long Island. MS-13 had been at war with rival local gangs, namely with Barrio 18, a gang conflict that has led to the deaths of thousands over the years in both the US and in Latin America, and the death of an innocent 29-year-old Islip man who happened to be wearing the wrong piece of clothing at the wrong place and wrong time. Back in 2016, 2 high school girls, Kayla Cuevas and Nisa Mickens, were targeted by MS-13 members and brutally beaten to death in the streets with an array of the same weapons, machetes and bats, and left to be found the next morning. A month after the double homicide, a 15-year-old member of Barrio 18 was killed in Calmeadow Park, beaten with machetes by a group of MS-13 gangsters. Only 3 days after that, a man was hacked to death on a neighborhood street in Brentwood, but the bodies of the 4 young men dumped out in the open was a shocking discovery. The 4, 20-year-old Michael Lopez Benegas, 18-year-old Jorge Tiguer, 18-year-old Jefferson Villalobos, and 16-year-old Justin Yevicura had gone missing the night prior, lured out to a park in Islip by 17-year-old Lenise Escobar and her friend 16-year-old Kaylee Gomez, who tricked the 4 into thinking they were going to smoke marijuana. In the dark of night, the 4 were ambushed by a squad of a dozen machete-wielding gangsters who hacked them to death, quote, in a horrific frenzy of violence. The 4, however, weren't rivals, nor were they a part of any gangland activity in Long Island. They'd been swept up in the violent Long Island underworld, a dark part of New York society populated with struggling drug addicts and the dealers who serve them, all as a result of a simple Instagram post that was taken as disrespect by the gang. This is the MS-13 takeover of Long Island.
The Roosevelt Preserve?
What we have found are human remains.
Police say the bodies found last year were also victims of MS-13, but they believe the killing has stopped as they work to take down members of this gang.
Mara Salvatrucha, or MS-13, formed in the 1980s in Los Angeles when Salvadoran immigrants moved into the area during the era of the Salvadoran Civil War. A violent coup started in October of 1979 by the Soviet-backed FMLN army, who went against the US-backed government of El Salvador. Young immigrants in the Los Angeles neighborhoods of Pico Union, Rampart, and Westlake began to come together, mostly to keep each other safe from other gangs and listen to heavy metal, while many of them openly adhered to Satanism. This began to set the stage for MS-13, which formed when other established gangs like Clanton 14, a Mexican street gang, began to harass the Salvadorans. They began to take a defensive, and soon enough, this spiraled into full-blown gang warfare. The satanic influence of the gang's early stages can still be seen today in their tattoos, hand symbols, nicknames, and general practices of violence.
is 18th Street. They see each other, they kill each other.
We don't get along with MS, no, MS, you know. We don't like that hood, you know.
Monkey is an 18th Streeter deported from Hollywood a few years ago. He now hangs out in this Honduran neighborhood with an 18th Street clique called Johnson, or as they say it, Johnson.
Ernesto Deras, a former member of the Salvadoran Special Forces, had joined the army at 16 in 1986, but 3 years later was wounded in combat and allowed asylum in the US. He settled in Los Angeles, where the Salvadoran diaspora was heavy. He enjoyed fighting, and within a year of coming to LA, he'd become the head of a 100-man MS-13 clique on Fulton Street. His crew led a wave of terror on the area, going up against several rival gangs using their weapons of choice: machetes, axes, and for Deras, satanic curses. Their sheer level of brutality, inspired by their occult practices, was commonplace among members of MS-13 who usually swarmed their victims in a mob and beat them to death. Deras left the gang before the turn of the century, but not before causing damage in the area. In 1990, Barrio 18, a longer established street gang in LA, came into conflict with MS-13 for unknown reasons, and the two gangs started a bloody conflict where murders became indiscriminate and simply done in the name of gang allegiance. Starting in 1992, members of both Barrio 18 and MS-13 were deported back to El Salvador at the conclusion of the Civil War, and with them came a new civil war. Gang death squads hit the streets of Central America as the two continued their fighting down south. Over the last 3 decades, this street war has turned Central America into the world's bloodiest region. Tattoos in MS-13 are relatively common. Many members of the gang signal the clique they belong to using them. In Long Island, New York, 2 of these cliques included the Sailors Locos West Side clique and the Hollywood Locos clique. Long Island is no stranger to gangland activity. For years, the area has been plagued by gangs ranging from small local drug dealers to members of the Bloods, Barrio 18, and Mafia drug crews, who all use the region to sell oxycodone, dope, and coke, and oftentimes as a burial ground for whoever gets in their way. The Sailors clique operated in the neighborhoods of Central Islip and Brentwood, and was led by brothers Jairo Sayans, nicknamed Funny, and Alexi Sayans, nicknamed Blasty. The gang was run out of Alexi Sayans' home in Central Islip, and in order to finance the gang, the Sailors clique obtained shipments of Central American cocaine and passed it down to members of their gang to sell across Brentwood and Islip. The Hollywood clique was run in Roosevelt, a town 40 minutes away, led by Kevin Torres. The profits made from their drug sales were wired to MS-13 leaders in Central America and used to buy weapons to keep their enterprise running. In 2016 and 2017, an uptick in brutal violence in the region came as a result of the brothers trying to take over the area's drug rackets. This meant torturing, raping, and killing anyone they could who was associated with the Bloods, Barrio 18, and the Brentwood Goon Squad. On the evening of January 28, 2016, Alexi Sayans spotted a 29-year-old man named Michael Johnson, an alleged member of the Bloods gang, at the Jocarena Deli in Brentwood, and formed a plot to kill him. Alexi lured Johnson out to the woods that night to smoke marijuana when Jairo and several others ambushed him from behind and stabbed and chopped him to death with a machete. On February 2nd, 2016, a man walking through the woods came across the brutal scene and contacted 911. In April of 2016, in a meeting at Alexi Sayans' home, it was agreed that a former member of their gang, 19-year-old Oscar Acosta, would have to be killed after associating with members of Barrio 18. The men agreed on who would act out what role in the murder plot. On the night of April 29, 2016, a small group of MS-13 members met Acosta in the woods in Brentwood to smoke marijuana when they jumped him with heavy tree branches, tied him up, and loaded him into Alexi and Jairo Sayans' pickup truck. They drove Acosta, conscious and alive, to a woodland area near the Pilgrim State Psychiatric Hospital, an abandoned mental institution off Sagtico State Parkway, where they used machetes to chop him up and buried his lacerated body in the woods. It wouldn't be until September 16 when police discovered his shallow grave while, ironically, searching for a different body of an MS-13 victim. On the night of May 21st, 2016, using their general modus operandi, the Sailors Clique planned to murder Barrio 18 member Karen Pineda and worked with the Hollywood Clique to do it. That night, Pineda was lured out to the woods while Kevin Torres, Victor Lopez Morales, and David Sosa Guevara stood by as lookouts. Pineda entered the woods when he was swarmed by a group of rivals who used machetes to hack him to death and buried in a pre-dug hole. On the night of September 4, 2016, a meeting was held at the Scions' home where it was decided that they'd begin going out actively on the hunt for rival gangsters instead of just killing them when they came across them. The men got into several cars and began patrolling Central Islip when Alexei Scions saw 27-year-old Marcus Bohannon, an alleged member of the Bloods, walking in the early hours of September 5th. Two clique members walked up to him and shot him 9 times, killing him right there in the street. That same night, about 40 minutes away in Roosevelt, Hollywood Clique members Carlos Alfaro, Jose Moises Blanco, Oseas Gonzalez, and Victor Lopez Morales lured Barrio 18 member Josue Amaya Leonor to the Roosevelt Preserve Park to smoke when, like the last murders, he was chopped up with machetes and buried in a deep hole. A week later, the sailors were out on the hunt again, looking for other rivals. This time, 15-year-old Nisa Mickens and 16-year-old Kayla Cuevas. The two girls, not a part of a gang, had gotten into several fights at Brentwood High School with other students, young members of MS-13 online, which eventually led to a confrontation in real life. After the fight, the Scions brothers greenlit killing the two girls. On the night of September 13, 2016, while on the hunt for rivals, Sailors Clique member Selvin Chavez was driving a car with 19-year-old Enrique Portillo and 2 high school members of the gang when they spotted and recognized the girls walking on Staley Street, a neighborhood road where Cuevas lived. Portillo called one of the Scions brothers and got permission to kill them. Chavez drove up by them while Portillo and the other 2 chased the pair with bats and a machete. Mickens was struck in the back of the head with a bat and in the face with a machete, beaten with both weapons, while Cuevas was struck in the head with a bat and across her body with a machete. The 3 killers then retreated to the car and they left with the Scions brothers to the Central Islip home, changed clothes, and hid the murder weapons. In the fallout of the slaying, Kayla Cuevas' mother, Evelyn Rodriguez, became an anti-gang activist and was even invited to the 2018 State of the Union, where the issue of gangs moving across the US border was discussed.
Struggling communities, especially immigrant communities. Evelyn, Elizabeth, Freddie, and Robert, tonight everyone in this chamber is praying for you. Everyone in America is grieving for you. Please stand. Thank you very much. Tonight I am calling on Congress to finally close the deadly loopholes that have allowed MS-13 and other criminal gangs to break into our country.
On the morning of September 14, 2018, 2 years after her daughter was killed, Rodriguez was at the site of her memorial on Staley Street when she saw a local resident, Anne-Marie Drago, defacing the memorial and stealing items from it before attempting to flee. Drago lived in the home behind where the 2 girls had been killed and was upset that the memorial was on the sidewalk in front of her. Rodriguez got in front of the car in an attempt to stop her from leaving before Drago ran over and killed her. Anne-Marie Drago was sentenced to probation after an overturned 9-month prison sentence. On the night of October 10, 2016, Torres and the Scions brothers ordered the murder of 15-year-old Javier Castillo, a member of the Barrio 18 gang. Torres stood in Cow Meadow Park as a lookout while Jairo Scions led Castillo to the park to smoke marijuana. And then, Jairo, Alexi, and others took turns swinging a machete at their victim and buried him in the marsh. 3 days later, 34-year-old Dewan Stacks was walking through a neighborhood in Brentwood when he was ambushed by the Sayans brothers. Alexei stayed around as a lookout as Jairo drove 3 men towards Dewan. The 3 then jumped out of the car, one wielding a bat and 2 wielding machetes, and brutally hacked Stacks to death in the road. The beating was so brutal that he was almost unrecognizable the following morning. It was reported afterwards that they only believed he was a member of the Bloods, but he was actually an innocent civilian. The final murder tied to the Sayans brothers took place in the early morning hours of January 30, 2017, when Alexei Sayans and 2 others were at El Campesino Deli, a deli in Central Islip, and spotted an innocent man, 29-year-old Esteban Alvarado Bonilla, wearing a football jersey that had the number 18 on it.
Investigate a suspected gang killing in a deli. A clerk was also wounded. CBS 2's Tracy Carrasco with the story now from Central Islip.
Detectives scoured the crime scene outside the El Campesino Deli on Caleb's Path, searching dumpsters and sewer drains for the gun used to shoot and kill a man who had just entered the store.
At the hospital, the male victim was pronounced dead. His name is being withheld pending notification of his family. At this point, we do believe that the shooting victim was targeted.
Alexei took that to mean that Bonilla was a member of Barrio 18 and plotted to kill him that same morning. Jairo drove a group of gangsters, Jose Suarez, Kevin Cifuentes, and Mario Aguilar Lopez, to get a mask and a car, while Alexei got a 9mm handgun, and they got together that same morning. Suarez drove Cifuentes and Aguilar Lopez to the deli and waited in the parking lot. Cifuentes entered, posing as a bystander to scope out the place and ensure everything went according to plan. Then, Aguilar Lopez, donning a mask, ran inside and shot Alvarado Bonilla so many times in the head that one of the bullets flew out the other side and hit a female cashier in the process, but she survived as the trio fled. The open and unashamed brutality of the Sayans brothers would be the thing that eventually led to their downfall. The Sailors Clique takeover of Central Islip came to an end in the early hours of March 2nd, 2017, when police in Long Island led raids on the homes of the MS-13 members, arresting 13 men, 10 of whom were illegal immigrants. The Sayans brothers were charged with their involvement in 8 murders between 2016 and the beginning of 2017, and with the help of Cifuentes becoming an informant in exchange for protection, were charged with killing Esteban Alvarado Bonilla. Enrique Portillo, one of the 10 undocumented immigrants, pleaded guilty to the murders of Mickens and Cuevas, apologized to the court, and stated in Spanish, to add to the record, that he never became an informant. Alexei and Jairo Sayans were both charged for their roles in the 8 murders and pleaded guilty in 2025. Throughout his trial, while waiting for court dates in prison, Alexei was engaged in gang activity, smuggling phones in, carrying shanks, and getting into fights with rival inmates. He told the court during his sentencing, through a translator, quote, "I know my apology will not repair the harm and pain that I have caused. I know many of you do not accept my apology, but I want to say from the bottom of my heart that these words are sincere." He didn't look the families of his victims in the eyes during his trial, and in July of 2025, a 30-year-old Alexei Sayans received 68 years in prison.
The prosecution says most of his victims were innocent, like Alvarado's daughter. She brought her ashes with her as she made her emotional plea for justice.
Strong and solid so that I can talk for her.
Last year, Sayans pleaded guilty for his role in the murder. The case prompted President Donald Trump to make several visits to Long Island during his first term in the White House. In court, Sayans apologized to the families of his victims, but none accepted it, like the father of Michael Johnson.
You heard me tell him, look at me. His face is to the floor. No, look at me. He's learned nothing.
Following the takedown of the Sailor Locos Salvatrucha's West Side Clique in March of 2017, an organization by the name of the Guanacos Lil Psychos Salvatruchas Clique became the dominant MS-13 cell in Central Islip, which now brings us back to the beginning of the video, April of 2017. 5 young men, Michael Lopez Benegas, Jorge Tigre, Jefferson Villalobos, Justin Yivicura, and Elmer Alexander Arteaga Ruiz, had been discussing on Facebook Messenger for some time on how to join MS-13. Villalobos wasn't a resident of Long Island, but rather of Florida, and had been up north visiting his cousin Benegas and his grandmother for Easter. Ruiz, who'd been arrested in March of that year for possessing marijuana, had been spearheading, talking about joining MS-13 to the other 4 men, with Jorge Tigre even saying, quote, "I'll do it." However, they were nothing more than young men enamored by the lifestyle of local gangsters. Ruiz eventually posted an image to his social media in which he and another member of the 5 made MS-13 gang signs and wore MS-13 inspired outfits. The post was simply made to look bad and attract girls, but it was also seen by then 17-year-old Lenise Escobar, nicknamed Diablita, or Little Devil. She was the girlfriend of MS-13 member Jeffrey Amador, nicknamed Cruel, who had a high standing within the Guanacos Lil Psychos clique. Her ex-boyfriend, Sergio Vladimir Segovia Pineda, nicknamed Terrible, was also an active member of the clique. Escobar then showed the post to Amador and told him that the gang was being overrun by rivals. This caused a stir to form within the clique, and the post was shown around. It was then agreed that they would kill the 5 for what they viewed as pure disrespect towards the gang, taking their symbols, acting like they were a part of them, just to get women without putting in the work of actually being a gangster. On the night of April 11, 2017, Lenise Escobar and her friend, 16-year-old Kaylee Gomez, then lured the 5 men out to a park in Central Islip, playing on their desire to hang out with girls. They drove them to the park under the pretense of smoking marijuana, but as they all hung out in a small woodland patch behind the park, the attack began. A dozen or so men, including Sergio Pineda, Josue Portillo, Omar Antonio Villalta, who was nicknamed Anticristo, or Antichrist, Edwin Rodriguez, and a few others, were hiding behind a metal fence that had a hole in it. Villalta began passing around weapons, including a knife to Rodriguez, a chisel to Sergio Pineda, and an axe, machete, and large tree stems. Escobar then sent a text telling them it was time to strike. The men swarmed the group of 5 while the 2 girls watched and commanded them to get on their knees and told them that if they moved, they were dead. Ruiz panicked, got up, and ran for his life. He hopped a fence and a stone wall as he heard someone yelling to chase him when the carnage began. Over the next few minutes, the 12 gangsters ran after and brutally attacked the 4 remaining victims, striking them on the ground, beating them, and killing them. They then dragged them deeper into the woods, put the bodies in a pile, and left the area. One of the victims during the killings had grabbed at Escobar, leaving his blood on her, which she allegedly licked off and swallowed. The 2 women allegedly smiled when the final victim, Michael Lopez Benegas, was stabbed to death by Rodriguez and Sergio Pineda. By the end of the night, 4 innocent men were dead. In the following few days, things began falling apart quickly for the local MS-13 gangsters. Escobar destroyed evidence of that night, getting rid of her bloody sweatshirt and throwing her phone out of a moving car, which, unknown to her, was being followed by police. Her alibi that night was that she and Gomez had been robbed at the same park. She also called Amador and told him over the phone that the 4 men had taken a train, had seen the light, and would never come back. She added that, quote, "But one of them managed to still be here on the map. He knows stuff about me." She also added that she was happy the murders had happened. The following night, the bodies were discovered in the woods by a passerby, so disfigured that they couldn't be recognized, and police began an investigation. Rodriguez, then 17, fled to El Salvador, where he was born, while Villalta ran away to Charlottesville, Virginia, where members of the Guanacos Los Psychos clique operated. One of them worked at a pizzeria and got Villalta a job there. In July of 2017, his co-worker, Marvin Rivera Guevara, flashed him a Barrio 18 hand signal, and Villalta reported to his higher-ups that Guevara was a rival. In the latter hours of July 3rd, 2017, Villalta and the MS-13 member who worked at the pizzeria lured Guevara to the woods to smoke marijuana, where they held him at gunpoint, led him deeper into the woods, and beat him with a machete. They then threw him off a bridge into a river. police in Long Island, in coordination with the FBI and the Department of Justice, began to investigate the slayings in the area. On July 19, 2017, 3 months later, 15 members of MS-13, including Vialta, were rounded up and charged with killing the 4 men, and in Vialta's case, with killing Guevara. All but Rodriguez were caught up in the sweep, who remained in El Salvador until an Interpol notice got him caught in August of 2019 and extradited to the US in 2022. At the beginning of the trial against Linés Escobar in 2022, Kaylee Gomez, Sergio Vladimir Pineda, and Jeffrey Amador all flipped to the state and testified against her and the rest of the gang about the night of the killing.
Dr. Michael Kaplan, the head pathologist that worked with the Suffolk County Office of the Medical Examiner in 2017, also testified and gave some gruesome details on the injuries that he observed on the 4 men, including blunt force and sharp object injuries on all of their heads. A photo was shown in court of the bloodied bodies found close together. Dr. Kaplan was responsible for doing the autopsies on Justin Livacura and Jefferson Villalobos. He claims their extensive injuries were the worst out of the 4 men. He says they also found evidence of very recent marijuana use in the 2 men. As News 12 has reported, Escobar allegedly helped get the men into the woods by offering them pot. The sole survivor of the attack, Alexander Ruiz, testified last week that the gang ordered all of the men onto the ground in the park, and Ruiz ran for his life.
Escobar's phone conversation, in which she bragged about the 4 deaths, was played to the court. Her defense team attempted to paint it as though she didn't know the killings would happen and was afraid of the gang, but the court sided against her. In 2024, Josu Portillo received 55 years in prison, Escobar received 50 years after a 4-week-long trial, and Rodriguez, as a part of his plea agreement, would be charged as an adult despite committing the crime as a 17-year-old, and received 50 years with a concurrent deportation order following his release. In 2025, Vialta received 55 years for multiple homicides.
The violent gang already claimed 11 young lives within the last year. 2 weeks ago, 4 young men were found brutally beaten in this central Islip park.
Last evening, that was October 20th, 1993, in front of 107-35 110 Street. Mr. Joseph Scopa was the victim of a homicide. Mr. Scopa received multiple gunshot wounds to his body. He thus expired at Jamaica Hospital a short time later.
During the 40s and the 50s, more and more people fell victim not only to heroin, but to a host of synthetics. While long used as a means of temporary escape from the ghetto, marijuana in 1963 became one of the symbols of a youth in revolution. Our criminal statutes became harsher, penalties stiffer. There was virtually no difference in the eyes of the law between selling a deck of heroin on a street corner or selling marijuana in a college dorm.
The quiet on 102nd Road and 85th Street in Ozone Park, Queens, was interrupted last night with sounds that signaled murder. 2 gunshots to the neck that took the life from a 57-year-old.
It's 4 a.m. on December 20, 1973 in Bath Beach, Brooklyn. Neighbors in a residential building on the Bath Beach waterfront wake up to the spray of gunfire on the building's first floor. Police are called on the scene and come to find a murder suspect awaiting trial, Ralph Gaglione, shot dead in the building. Gaglione was a member of the Gambino Mafia family, a sprawling New York City gang with criminal ties all over the US and Italy. Gaglione was just one of hundreds of low-level criminals involved with the Mafia. He'd been killed for messing up a shooting in 1972, and his killer was 29-year-old Gerard Papa, a member of another Mafia named the Genovese family. Papa was a drug trafficker who'd survived shooting after shooting in the past, and became so good at making money and taking lives that his recklessness, violence, and arbitrary murders were always excused as a cost his bosses were willing to tolerate. But he would meet his own fate 7 years later in 1980. His fall began in '74 with the murder of his close friend James Emma, who was standing next to Papa as he cleaned his car in Bensonhurst. Drive-by killers sent by a leader within another mafia family named the Colombo family, Dominic Shallow, then drove up on the pair and sprayed them suddenly. Emma died as Papa leapt into a passing car through an open window, the driver barely noticing as he hit the gas in a panic to avoid the bullets. Shallow, in an unrelated matter, was later shot dead and buried in the basement of Otto's Social Club, found there alongside other human remains. Papa was later arrested by police and taken to the local precinct, where he filed paperwork for a police protection order. A lot of respect was lost for him after that move, and he became more vulnerable to his enemies. That buildup would lead to his fall in 1980. That year, a conflict had broken out among marijuana dealers in Bath Beach. Mafia brothers Ralph and Thomas Sparrow had been extorting New York marijuana dealers for years by then, but when one of their victims refused to comply, the Sparrow brothers kidnapped his child and held him for ransom. The dealer then put out a $500,000 contract for the Sparrows, the price so high since they both held big status in the New York underworld. Gerard Papa, Barclay Farenga, and 2 others accepted the contract. They shot Ralph dead outside his Bath Beach home, and then, soon after, kidnapped Thomas, killed him, and buried him in the foundation of a building that Papa owned. On July 11, 1980, at around 11:30 a.m., Papa walked into the Villa 66 restaurant when a group of Genovese hitmen, Dominic Cataldo, Nicholas Cataldo, and Joseph Cataldo Jr. shot him within seconds of him stepping foot inside, slamming him with fire from a sawed-off shotgun and leaving him for dead. His traumatic death also left his then 5-year-old son, John Papa, to be raised by the streets.
You could still hear the Christmas music coming from the house. Vincent Fasaro had been hanging a Christmas garland around the door when he was shot from behind. His wife and mother were inside the house and heard the shots.
Papa's life began on July 19, 1974, born into the family of his mafia killer father, who had a reputation of taking lives left and right. When his father was clipped on the cusp of his son's 6th birthday, Papa's mother moved to Holmdel, New Jersey to get her son away from his father's life. He did well in school and went on to become a high school soccer athlete, but he had aspirations for the streets. His stepfather was a drug trafficker as well, who ended up getting incarcerated while Papa was still young. Living under his father's legacy, John Papa got a tattoo on his arm that said Papa Bear, one of the nicknames his dad was given by his friends, and had Morte prima de dishonore, death before dishonor, tattooed across his back in Italian. He began going back and forth to Staten Island and eventually hooked up with drug dealers and began slinging himself. He came into contact with James Gaglione, a member of a New York mafia named the Lucchese family. Gaglione was a coke dealer and was the son of the murdered Ralph Gaglione. He came up in 1989 when he successfully murdered Costabile Farace, a 29-year-old Bushwick gangster, strongman, and drug dealer who'd killed an undercover DEA agent. Farace went on the run for over a year before his location was found, and Gaglione gunned him down in the middle of the street on the night of November 17, 1989. However, Gaglione didn't want Papa and his crew due to Papa's father being his father's murderer, and so Papa, who still had jobs with Gaglione's drug crew, found an entrance into the Colombo Mafia and took it, but he would take it at arguably the worst time.
In Brooklyn, a low-level mobster is put to rest, shot dead in broad daylight. Days later, another reputed gangster snuffed out, execution style. Then gunfire at a bagel shop kills an innocent teenager. He's sprayed with bullets meant for someone else.
When Papa joined the family around 1990, they were unstable. The gang's boss, Carmine Persico, was sitting in prison with a 140-year-long life sentence. Victor Orena, who was a professional gangster who modeled himself like a businessman in the real world, had been chosen by Persico to run the mafia for him, since Persico's brother Alphonse was also in jail. Orena kept things civil within the family, but he was making his own decisions and taking lives where he saw fit. Influence started creeping in from outside sources. namely the boss of the Gambino family, John Gotti, who saw Orena as an opportunity to get rid of his rival Persico. The mafia clans of New York City were run by a commission, which was a board of directors for the Italian mafia. Each family had its own vote on the board, but with Gotti's friend Orena running the Colombo family, if he was able to get rid of Persico, he could essentially have 2 votes. And so, he began pushing for Orena to get rid of Persico's people. Orena went to the commission and tried to push for them to oust Persico, but they rejected his request. He then tried a second way, going to his advisor Carmine Sessa, a gang official known as a consigliere within the mafia world, and asked Sessa to indiscreetly take a vote of who within the Colombo family was with him and who was with Persico. His consigliere then traveled out to FCI Lompoc, visited Persico in the prison, and exposed what Orena was doing. On June 20, 1990, Sessa and 4 others parked down the street by Orena's home and waited for him to arrive. But he came down the road in the same direction that they did, and once he recognized their faces, hit the gas and sped away. On November 18, 1991, one of Persico's strongest loyalists, Greg Scarpa, was ambushed while out driving with his daughter and grandson in a separate car behind him, but he managed to slam the gas, crash into bystanders, and escape his would-be killers. The shooting left him alive, but shaken up and angry. Scarpa was dying, having gotten AIDS from a blood transfusion gone wrong, as the donor who he'd gotten the blood from was a steroid user who got AIDS off of a dirty needle. With Scarpa's worsening condition, he didn't have much to lose.
Scarpa was considered a top echelon informant, and great care was taken to keep their meetings secret.
Also fueling things was the fact that he was an undercover FBI informant, unknown to anyone around him due to the fear and respect he got for his brutality.
Hines says that when an innocent victim was gunned down last November in what he called a mob-controlled bagel shop, something had to be done.
Scarpa had been an informant for decades by then, and his status in the bureau allowed him to get away with essentially anything. His corrupt handler began egging him on to get things going in the street, and soon enough, Scarpa became Persico's one-man army. Following his shooting, he began patrolling Brooklyn with a crew, out looking for any of Orena's men so he could kill them right on the spot.
So far, at least 13 members of the Colombo crime family have been murdered. Another 16 barely escaped with their lives.
Between that fateful November 1991 afternoon and December of 1992, shootings plagued New York, several happening each week during some months. Scarpa and his men targeted anyone they could, including Teamster official Nicky Grancho, whose face was blown off by a shotgun, Orena soldier Vincent Fusaro, who was shot dead off a ladder outside of his home in front of his family while hanging up Christmas decorations, and Joel Cacace, one of Orena's top-ranking men and a cop killer who was shot numerous times outside a dry cleaner by Scarpa, but survived and switched sides to Persico. On December 8, 1991, Chris Liberatore, an Orena loyalist, was out on the hunt with the crew for Francis Guerra and Anthony Ferrara as revenge for Fusaro's murder. When their hunt failed, they went home, but Liberatore's friend James Malpeso was shot that same day, and James's father decided blood needed to be spilled. Liberatore walked into Wanabagel, a mafia hangout owned by Guerra, and shot the 17-year-old cashier Matteo Speranza, a civilian, dead at the register. Things started to fall apart nearing the end of 1992. On December 29, Scarpa, under house arrest at this point, went with his son Joey to a home owned by Michael De Rosa and Ronald Moran, 2 street dealers who worked for the Lucchese family. There was a failed drug deal between them and Joey, so Scarpa drove his son up to the home, knocked on the door, and shot De Rosa, while Moran shot back and took out one of Scarpa's eyes. Following the shooting, Scarpa's parole was revoked, and he was returned to prison, now half-blind and dying of AIDS. Police closed in on the Colombo family through the assistance of informants, catching Orena hiding out at the construction site of his girlfriend's home on April 4, 1992. Sessa flipped, as did Persico loyalists John Patte and Lawrence Mazza, Scarpa's young protege, who police named in 25 murders. Police cracked down hard on the Colombo family, arresting 60 men from Persico's side and 61 from Orena's side. 30 people were dead, 3 of whom were civilians, and 18 of whom went missing and were never seen again. The final strike of the war took place on October 20, 1993, a well-planned murder job carried out by John Papa, who had the dream of finally being made within the family.
Last evening, that was October 20th, 1993, in front of 107-35 110th Street, and Mr. Joseph Scopa was the victim of a homicide. Mr. Scopa received multiple gunshot wounds to his body. He thus expired at Jamaica Hospital a short time later.
So many of Persico's men were off the streets by that point that the ones left began outsourcing their work to lower-level gangsters, dealers, and addicts. Joseph Scopa was a major mobster, his entire life spent within the Colombo family. He was the vice president of a cement union, and more importantly, ran a second-in-command, his highest-ranking captain. Back in the 1970s, Scopa teamed up with Gambino mobsters John Gotti and his brother Gian to hijack trucks, and by the 90s was running a large-scale loan sharking ring with Gian Gotti, which had $1 million out in street loans. Persico's family wanted Scopa gone, and so the order was passed through his nephew Theodore, known as Skinny Teddy. Theodore, in prison, was allowed to attend his grandmother Eleanor's funeral at the Scarpacci Funeral Home. While at the funeral, in the view of correction officers and his hands cuffed up, he turned to a trio of Persico loyalists, including Anthony Russo, and whispered, "You've got to kill Joey." The order was then passed down a chain of command. Russo got the word out on the street, while Theodore's cousin Michael Persico got a MAC-10 with a suppressor, and then handed it off to an intermediary who got the gun to a hit crew. The crew was set up by Eric Curjo, a drug dealer and chop shop owner, who brought together his friends John Spedicino and John Papa. Meanwhile, Russo served as a getaway driver, while Francis Guerra drove a third car and put it in the middle of the street to block any traffic. Curjo was a drug dealer and auto body shop owner. His friend Joey Borti would go around Carroll Gardens at night, driving through the streets, looking for cars parked on the side of the road. He would then smash them up and pour corrosive materials on them, to the point that the car owners would have no choice but to get them repaired. The nearest shop to the area was Curjo's shop, generating artificial business for himself.
We believe so, yes.
The perpetrators were waiting for you. Is that correct?
That's what our indications are, yes.
On the night of October 20, 1993, Scopa was driving home from dinner with his nephew Dominic Logazzo and his daughter's fiancée Angelo Barone. He planned to go meet with John Gotti loyalists Michael De Leonardo and his son John Gotti Jr. But as he pulled up to his Queens home, Spercino sprayed Scopa's car but missed every shot. Scopa managed to get out and took off running, while Spercino dropped the MAC-10, hit the gas, and sped away. Curjo stood and watched as Papa then chased Scopa, who hid behind a tree. He was afraid that his victim had a gun, but when Scopa threw a phone at him as a way to try and scare him off, Papa shot him 8 times with a .380. He and Curjo then took off running as a witness watched them run 3 whole blocks to another getaway vehicle. Scopa was the final death in the Colombo family's vicious war, but it wouldn't be Papa's last. It did, ironically, however, mark the beginning of the end for his career on the street, despite having just started. A couple of days after the hit, Russo was approached by others within the family who wanted answers about who killed Scopa, but he told them he had no idea. He soon discovered that Curjo was going around openly bragging about the hit to build infamy, despite Papa being the shooter. Russo and Guerra then went to Michael Persico and complained that Curjo was talking too much, causing concerns to form. Meanwhile, Papa, now just 19, grew a taste for blood and began getting more swaggerish. He thought he was gonna get made at any second due to the slaying of such a high-level gangster, and all he wanted to do now was sell more drugs and take more lives. Papa, Spercino, and Curjo had a strong relationship. The trio were friends with a number of other local gangsters, including Calvin Henniger and Rolando Rivera. Curjo and Papa would often eat dinner at Spercino's mother's home, who saw them as her son's best friends. They were also close to Spercino's brother Salvatore, and they all worked together on the streets to try and make money at a young age. On June 7, 1994, Papa and Curjo would take Rivera's life. Cracks were forming within their friend group. Spercino began to go around claiming all the credit for Scopa's murder, despite never getting a single shot on him. Curjo then told Rivera to stay away from Spercino, hinting that they were planning on killing him. For whatever reason, Rivera felt the need to tell his girlfriend the information. Word spreads fast in the underworld, but bullets spread faster. If word got to Spercino that Curjo had issued such a warning, he could strike first and kill Curjo. On June 7, 1994, Curjo and Papa picked up Rivera in a stolen van, drove him into Staten Island, and shot him in the car before pushing him onto the street without stopping. Rivera laid in the street, bleeding out in agony across the day, until an off-duty cop saw him that night and called for help, but Rivera passed away right after. Papa would take his next life a month later. Issues arose between him and Anthony Della Vecchia, a drug dealer who worked for James Gallione, as Papa had reason to believe that Della Vecchia had killed one of his close friends. However, Della Vecchia, like Gallione, was in the Lucchese family and had protected status. And so, Papa planned on killing Della Vecchia's cousin, Carmine Gargano Jr., a drug dealer and a 21-year-old student at Pace University. Just a few days prior to the murder plot, 6'2", 230-pound Gargano had gone into a fight with Michael DeRosa at T-Bird's Bar and Grill, and DeRosa threatened to kill Gargano as security forced him out of the establishment. It was the perfect opportunity for Papa to strike and frame DeRosa for the hit. Dino Calabro, the protege of Colombo War veteran Thomas Gioelli, who himself was close to the family's top administration, including Joel Cacace, now the leader of the family, organized Gargano Jr.'s murder and got his own protege, Joseph Compatiello, to take care of it. On July 10, 1994, at around midday, Gargano left his parents' Brooklyn home to go jet skiing. When he suddenly went missing, Compatiello and Papa then took him to Sunshine Collision, a car shop in Coney Island, and shot him. However, the bullets didn't instantly kill the 6'2" Gargano, who put up a struggle, and Compatiello had to grab the shovel they were going to use to bury him to slam him in the head until he fell. They then buried the body in the shop, and Papa began bragging about how no one would ever see him again. They later had to move the body to another site in Long Island, when Gargano's parents began investigating the murder and got threats from the Mafia members in response. Later that year, a leader within another New York Mafia clan named the Bonanno Mafia family, Anthony Graziano, began planning to murder Papa. Papa and Hennigar had been at Graziano's strip club in Staten Island when they shot the place up for unknown reasons, leading to the club falling into a panic and one of the customers getting shot and wounded. Graziano began pushing for his people to go out and murder the two Colombo thugs, but was brought to a meeting with their supervisors, and the men all reached the settlement, saving Papa and Hennigar. Graziano would be indicted for conspiracy to commit murder over the episode just 8 years later. Papa and Curcio then turned their attention to Sparacino. John Sparacino, Eric Curcio, and Papa had all begun sharing their own versions of the Scopo murder, Papa's two friends taking the street credit for the slaying. Sparacino especially, who'd missed every shot and taken off running during the hit, was the most vocal about his supposed role. One night, the trio were partying with mutual friend Dino Basciano at Basciano's club. But after Papa and Curcio left, Basciano and Sparacino stayed behind to chat. Sparacino waited for his friends to leave, then gave them a disgusted look and told Basciano that he'd done the Scopo job and that they were punks who'd left him behind while he took care of business. Basciano found the two that same night and asked them if what Sparacino said was true. Papa then allegedly turned bright red and said he would cut Sparacino's heart out. On August 13, 1994, Hennigar lured Sparacino to his home in Staten Island. He was allegedly so eager to murder Sparacino, he couldn't even hold himself back, and shot Sparacino in the back of the head before Papa showed up. Papa then eventually arrived, irate that Hennigar had killed Sparacino first, and began mutilating the body. They hog-tied him, and Papa attempted to skin Sparacino's face off to wear it as a mask, starting at the cheek and trying to pull the rest of it off. When that didn't work, they castrated their victim's body and stuffed his into his mouth. 2 days later, they got the body from Hennigar's home in a stolen car, drove him out to another part of the island, and burned the car with Sparacino's body in it. Curcio later told Iborti about what had happened, and Iborti was growing concerned by Papa's deranged behavior. Papa called Iborti at some point in October, less than 2 months after Sparacino's murder, and promised him that he was going to kill Curcio as well. Curcio had been taking credit for the Scopo slaying, and not giving Papa as much as he believed he deserved. So now Curcio had to go. Allegedly, Curcio had also killed a mutual friend of his and Papa's, making Papa's anger worse. However, no one was willing to help him out with the job. He attempted to enlist help from other Colombo gangsters, but everyone rejected him, leading to him doing it himself. On October 4, 1994, Papa walked into Curcio's auto body shop and, without warning, sprayed his friend 10 times and left. The next day, he called Iborti, laughing and mocking Curcio. He began making machine gun noises, stopped, laughed a bit, and then made more gun noises after explaining how he'd killed Curcio.
From Oakland, California, our guest tonight,
big time.
Curcho's slaying would be the last recorded one done by Papa, but accusations of taking part in 6 other murders exist, including the random slaying of a stranger one night after he got dared to do it. Papa had dreams of becoming a Colombo superstar and obtaining the status of a street legend, but at the end of the day, all he was another thug, a disposable killer for a crime family who didn't care too much for him and didn't pay him too well. He still had to sling drugs to make a living, despite being quick with the trigger, and he wasn't even offered official membership into the family between 1994 and 1997, and by the end of his career on the streets, he'd only been working for the better part of just 5 years. Police investigators were closing in on him. Informants in his circle, including Aborti and Russo, as well as overwhelming evidence for him and Henniger's involvement in the murders, led police to issuing a warrant for Papa's arrest on September 26, 1997. As police went out to grab him that evening, Papa was getting ready for his friend's wedding rehearsal. Salvatore Spadaccino, the brother of the man Papa had secretly helped kill and mutilate, was getting married, and Papa was invited to the wedding. As he stood on the steps of St. Anne's Church in Staten Island, a troop of NYPD cars stopped on the curb and cops ran out with their handguns drawn. NYPD detective Thomas Dades yelled at Papa to surrender, leading to Papa whipping out a handgun and pointing it at the cops while clutching his stomach in a panic. They yelled at him to drop it, and he charged into the church as the crowd of relatives and friends stood by shocked. Papa eventually chucked his gun under a pew and surrendered, while Salvatore Spadaccino berated one of the officers for arresting him like that in a church. One of the detectives revealed to Salvatore that they were arresting Papa for killing his brother. Papa underwent a short trial that saw testimony from some of his former friends and associates, including Russo, who implicated several mafia figures like Francis Guerra in the Scopo murder, as well as Theodore Persco for ordering it, and Michael for getting the gun. By the end of his trial, Papa, still only 24 years old, got 4 life sentences and 45 years for drug trafficking, to be served without parole. He was one of the youngest mafia members in America to get such a sentence, if not the youngest. He wasn't forgotten in prison, however. He obviously had mafia contacts within the walls and received money regularly from mafia figures and their relatives, people like Joseph Chilli, George Zappola, Ilario Sessa, and Francis Guerra. The money allowed him to live a little more comfortably within USC Allenwood's harsh conditions, allowing him to learn how to cook, spend his days reading, and following the Yankees on TV. He also began an email correspondence with Guerra that police investigated in the mid-2000s, where he wrote often about the Yankees, cooking pasta, and making stromboli. In mid-2025, Papa attempted to file for compassionate release, citing his time in prison as transformative, but his request was denied by the court, who cited statements made by the families of his victims, his lasting connections with organized crime figures behind bars, and the lack of empathy he held for his victims. It's likely that Papa, jailed at the age of just 22, will die behind bars.
We're sitting here, we're given an opportunity to kind of explain what happened that day. An opportunity.
Turn around and see a black guy with a hood on. He almost kind of looked like the guy that tried to shoot me in Locust Point. Go inside, is that okay?
Not right now.
Not going inside right now.
The failed hitmen, allegedly recruited by a leader in the Bloods gang, were captured running from Bronx police nearby. One of them sought cover in a parking lot, weaving in and out of cars.
What is the motive behind this? He would inherit it all anyway.
Well, listen, yeah, he would have definitely inherited it someday, right? But sometime for some people, someday is not fast enough.
8 months later, Anthony Satola was hauled in by the FBI.
I had a feeling you were coming. When, I don't know, but I can thank you that it was after Father's Day and it was after all my kids' birthdays.
Dirty money has its repercussions. In the world of gangs, that repercussion comes in the form of gangland justice or punishment. A man feeds his family with money obtained by drugs, murder and extortion, and in exchange, he's oftentimes brutally gunned down in front of them. The trauma of watching a gangland execution, namely for the family of the victim, is enough to ruin entire households forever. Following a gangland execution comes years of fear, living in hiding, and government seizures of assets that oftentimes leave the family starving, like the case of 26-year-old Detroit drug kingpin and murderer Khairi Kalasho, whose 1989 murder left his family open to mass government seizures that financially crippled them, and further murders against other relatives. His killer was Raid Jihad, the family friend of someone Kalasho had murdered that year.
This is the front porch of a house in the predominantly Chaldean section of Detroit's north side. The Chaldean family that lived here fled after a dynamite blast blew out the windows. A few blocks away, a Chaldean-owned auto repair shop on 7 Mile Road is back in business after a stick of dynamite left a crater in the floor of the service bay.
However, more times than not, it comes in the form of the children that money is earned to feed. The number of cases of the children of America's mafia gangsters growing up with incurable diseases, being tortured to death, dying of cancer, attempting suicide, or spending the majority of their life behind bars are almost endless. Like the threat of violence or incarceration, a gangster's children leading less than ideal lives is just another potential price to pay in the vastly profitable world of crime, where fast money rules and is taken and enforced through cheating, lying, theft, and oppression. However, no case speaks louder than that of Sylvester Zatola, multimillionaire, real estate investor, and New York mafia member.
The McDonald's hit was not traditional at all. Police busted an alleged member of the Bloods gang for conspiracy to commit murder. They're investigating whether Bashan Shelton might have been hired by Albanian gangsters.
By the time Zatola had reached his 60s, he'd achieved his dreams in life. He was in the top 1% of Americans by income and net worth. He had 2 sons, both successfully married businessmen with children, and a daughter who worked as a teacher and was herself married with 2 children. His family lived together in a large, multi-million-dollar townhouse compound on the New York waterfront in Throg's Neck. It was the kind of place that his family would live in forever and would raise their own kids in once they got older. But things didn't end up the way Zatola had planned. Raising his family with gangland money had its consequences that came in the form of his younger son, 45-year-old Anthony Zatola. Anthony's greed and his determination to not let anything get in the way of taking his father's business would destroy his family, his father's life, his brother's life, his sister's life, and his own life. Zatola, now 52, sits behind bars, living under a strict life without parole sentence. But it wasn't always this way. He was raised in an ideal, loving household under ideal circumstances. He used to make good money, worked hard for his family, co-owned a business, and was a part of the Zatola compound.
Some guy got shot in the parking lot.
This is a story of the inevitable consequences of feeding one's family with criminal money, and how the pursuit of trying to dishonestly make it somewhere almost always leads to a brutal failure.
Question, I want you to be honest with me.
I'm always on.
But you can't play with me. The other day you played with me and I let it go. I'm concerned with this Randy.
Nothing. Forget about it.
No, I mean, who knows about it?
At some point in the early 2000s, Thomas Crow, a detective with the NYPD, had spotted an odd scene across the street from his Pelham Bay apartment in the Bronx, New York. Hair salon owner Vinny Basciano parked in front of his driveway, got out of his car, and walked into the home across the street. Crow's neighbor across the street was one of Basciano's hairstylists at the Hello Gorgeous salon in the Bronx, named Deborah Kolb, who was also his girlfriend. Basciano wasn't just a hairstylist, he was the leader of one of New York City's most powerful criminal organizations named the Bonanno Family, a mafia with ties to Sicily, Canada, and Western Europe. Basciano wasn't always the gang's leader. Before him came his mentor, Joseph Massino, then in his 60s, but Massino was in jail, facing a major trial that could have gotten him the death penalty for multiple murders. Wanting to avoid his fate, Massino had been wearing a wire in his meetings with Basciano for a long time by that point. But before the FBI could make their move on Basciano, he was Massino's natural successor to a criminal empire worth millions, if not billions of dollars in assets, property, narcotics, and income. income among its members every year. Crow, against the advice of his wife, began monitoring Bashano's visits to Kolb's home, seeing her and her kids every single day. Bashano also used the home as a meeting place to meet gangsters close to him in the Mafia pyramid on the front patio so that they could talk in person. One of these men that Crow managed to catch on camera was Sylvester Zottola. Then in his mid-50s, Zottola was a real estate investor, a friend of Bashano's Mafia organization that had made a fortune on property around Brooklyn, and was Kolb's landlord. Zottola was a patriarch, the head of a tight-knit, business-oriented family comprising of his 3 children. Before he was a millionaire, he was a friend of the Mafia. Zottola got his start as a gambling operator, installing poker machines in local bars and cafes for another Mafia organization named the Lucchese family. He was a partner in the gambling business with Bashano and had made heavy money from these machines. As he approached his mid-age, he began pouring that money into real estate around the Bronx. By the mid-2010s, that empire was worth more than $45 million in assets, making Zottola a rich investor in the legal world, a well-respected hustler in the gangster world, and the father to 3 very comfortably raised children. Zottola's family was very close. His younger son, finance graduate Anthony Sr., helped manage his real estate properties, collect rent, and threaten tenants who didn't pay. Working with Anthony was his older brother Salvatore, who ran his dad's poker machines and owned a maintenance company named A&S Maintenance. A&S was used to run maintenance jobs on the vast network of rentals, homes and townhouses owned by Sylvester. Their sister Deborah was a teacher known in her community. By 2017, Sylvester's real estate company was large. His poker business was making him recurring income. His children were all successful. One of Sylvester's lifelong dreams had come to fruition in 2003 when he built a compound of multiple 4-story townhomes on the Brooklyn waterfront, across the street from the Locust Point Yacht Club in Throgs Neck, the same neighborhood that witnessed the 2013 execution of Michael Meldish right in the open. Meldish was a former gang leader who was absorbed by the Lucchese Mafia when his own gang fell apart in the 1980s, but after running up over $100,000 in debt to Lucchese leader Matthew Madonna had Meldish murdered. The 4-story compound was named Zottola's Court, and even had the name on a plaque adorning the front roof of one of the homes. Their backyard was large, a place where he and his family often held parties with their neighbors. However, there were some noticeable cracks forming in the Zottola family's foundation, between the father and his younger son Anthony. Anthony's greed and his rivalry with his father began to become more apparent when he moved out of the family home in 2017. In July of 2017, Anthony, his wife, and children left Zottola's Court and moved into a $1.5 million home 10 miles north of the compound, moving without once telling his father or brother beforehand. Issues started taking root following his move. Sylvester Zottola owned almost 30 multi-family buildings as a part of his real estate business, collectively making him $1.5 million in yearly income. Anthony's greed had been rooted in years of labor under his father. He came across a buyer at one point who offered $27 million up front for the over 24 properties. It would be a heavy payment in one go, and Anthony, as the one managing the properties, wanted to sell more than anything. However, it wasn't his business, it was his father's, and Sylvester disapproved of the sale and vetoed it. Anthony realized that if he wanted things to go his way, his father and older brother had to be out of the picture, and suddenly, despite seeming like the perfect family to people outside, an internal plan to kill off the Zottola family men began to form, fueled purely by greed and millions of dollars in residential properties. In August of 2017, his plans to turn on the family began to take root. That month, Anthony got into contact with Bouchon Shelton, a job recruiter working at a call center, and hired him to scare a tenant into paying his rent. Shelton had a criminal history. In 2009, he was charged with possession of a weapon that police found in his Lincoln Navigator, and after getting out in 2012, began trying to rack up credit on the street with the Bloods. Things went relatively well for Shelton, and he wasn't by any stretch an incompetent gangster. He held a day job at a call center, but by night was running a crew of 30 gangsters.
Thought it was a job, homie, a regular 9 to 5. You told us some joke and like his name, Shell, some like that.
Anthony began a text correspondence with Shelton that would soon transform into a 1,000 message long plot to murder Sylvester and Salvatore. It started in September of 2017, a month after the two gangsters came into contact.
Assortment of Bloods admit they staked out Satola family properties for more than a year, failing repeatedly to kill either target. Sylvester Satola called the cops in June 2018.
Anthony paid Shelton to attack his father outside Zatola Court. One afternoon, as Zatola stood on the front of his property, one of Shelton's gangsters put up his hood and charged Zatola, knocking the 70-year-old onto the ground and beating him before fleeing. But things quickly escalated from just a one-off beatdown of an elderly father. Anthony contacted Shelton, offering to pay him $200,000 and provide free home renovation services if Shelton murdered his father. Shelton tried with his own hands first. On November 26, 2017, he used the van to push Sylvester's car into Edgewater Park off the Throgs Neck Expressway and began opening fire on him. Sylvester threw his car in reverse, whipped it around, and hit the gas before Shelton could shoot him, and thus began the hunt for Sylvester in a year of torture, physically and emotionally, for the Zatola family. Anthony began passing down info about Sylvester's movements, locations, and routines to Shelton, and began revealing confidential information about his other relatives. Using coded language following the first failed shooting, Shelton wrote that the actor had gone in reverse in the middle of shooting a scene, acting like they were talking about filming a movie. Zatola told him he was going to change the location of the next scene to the actor's dressing room. Shelton put together a crew of gangsters who would turn out to be incredibly bad at their one job: to kill Sylvester. On December 25th, 2017, the Zatola family came together to celebrate Christmas Eve. Just 2 nights later, Anthony and Shelton coordinated the murder attempt at the actor's dressing room. Anthony sent Shelton a message telling him, "I get the keys to dressing room," and he passed his father's keys to Shelton. 3 of Shelton's crew then entered the home and waited for Sylvester to get back. As he entered the home that night, the 3 jumped him, pistol whipped him, chopped him up in the chest with a knife, and then slashed his throat before running. Sylvester barely clung on to life. Salvatore Zatola was called by their neighbor, who told him something had happened inside their home. And when he came to the home, he found his father leaning up against the wall, bleeding out. Police eventually came, and his father was moved to an ICU as investigators began searching the place. Anthony showed up as well, but unlike his brother, was impatiently waiting for the investigators to leave so he could clean the home up. He was asked to provide security camera footage from the home, but the video he gave them only showed the time proceeding and preceding the break-in and attack. And then he proceeded to quickly clean up the crime scene after they left, and even billed his father $3,500 for the home maintenance work. His family was concerned and were now truly living in fear. They had absolutely no idea who would be gunning after their father, who had no standing issues with any members of the Bonanno or Lucchese families.
He rented jukeboxes and cornered the market on joker poker in bars. But Sylvester Zatola's reign in the vending business ended at a McDonald's drive-thru.
Zatola was on somebody's list.
They're investigating whether Bouchon Shelton might have been hired by Albanian gangsters.
The Albanians traditionally have had a very sort of uneasy history with the Bonanno crime family.
Investigators first believed that it was either attempted mafia hits gone wrong, or possibly a rival gang muscling in on his territory. Theories emerged stating that it could have been the Bloods gang themselves coming for Sylvester, or that it was the New York Albanian mafia, who was a known gambling operator rival to the Italians. But no one, including his family, even so much as suspected Anthony.
What is the salt of the earth.
It's somebody that he knows. It's somebody that knows his routine.
I've been going to the precinct at least once a week to figure out what's going on here. I got nothing.
Salvatore began his own independent street investigation, but for the time being was inconclusive. Their father was alive and well, recovering in the hospital from his throat slashing, and Anthony still hadn't reached his goal.
Turn around, I see a black guy with a hood on. He almost kind of looked like the guy that tried to shoot me in Locust Point.
Go inside, is that okay?
Not right now.
Not going inside right now.
In the summer of 2018, things were kicked back into action. Ron Cabby, a gangster who just gotten out of prison, was introduced to Shelton by a mutual friend, Herman Blanco, trying to help him get a job. He asked Cabby, bluntly, if he was willing to kill for money. Shelton had told Blanco that he planned to pay Cabby $50,000 total, $25,000 for Sylvester and $25,000 for Salvatore, but changed his tune upon meeting Cabby and offered only $20,000. Shelton and Blanco then got Cabby a gun. That would kick off a 20-man plot involving changing drivers in 6 different murder attempts in their attempts to kill the father and son. One attempt was cancelled when Shelton and a driver were parked outside a property owned by Sylvester when his driver began smoking a blunt, leading to Shelton cancelling the job due to the smell. Another job failed when Cabby was parked outside a property, but his van failed and he needed Shelton to come by and jumpstart it. On June 12, 2018, Cabby and Hyman Ross, his getaway driver, were out on the hunt for Salvatore. Sylvester had been recovering in the hospital and then went into hiding out of fear for those coming after him. So their plan was to kill Salvatore in order to lure his father out and then come after him. However, they passed by a property owned by Zatola and saw the patriarch standing outside. Ross parked and Cabby stepped out. He stood near the home when Sylvester saw him and grew instantly nervous. He yelled to Cabby, who he didn't know, not to come any closer, but the hitman approached, pulled out his gun, pointed it directly at Sylvester's head and squeezed the trigger. Then the gun jammed and wouldn't fire. Sylvester immediately pulled out his own handgun and started firing, leading to Cabby running back to the car and Ross hitting the gas.
Turn around, I see a black guy with a hood on. He almost kind of looked like the guy that tried to shoot me in Locust Point.
Go inside, is that okay?
Not right now.
Not going inside right now.
The failed hitmen, allegedly recruited by a leader in the Bloods gang, were captured running from Bronx police nearby. One of them sought cover in a parking lot, weaving in and out of cars. At one point, the suspect removed his black jacket and gestured to his accomplice to be quiet. One man was caught that day, but prosecutors said suspect Hyman Ross got away.
Cabby later threw the gun away, but a nearby civilian saw him do it and called the police, unknown to him that it was used in a murder attempt just hours earlier. Cabby was arrested within the day. Also arrested was Zatola for felony weapons possession, which, ironically, kept him safe for the time being. He was afraid for his life, and making things worse was that he had no idea who was after him. Yet, his family was confident in their mafia protection and status, and didn't beef up their home security or travel around in armored vehicles or vests, despite knowing that someone was after them. A month later, on July 11, Ross and a driver were out stalking Salvatore. Blanco and Shelton were still coming after Salvatore in order to lure out his father. It was 6:30 a.m. when the two spotted Salvatore pull up by the compound. He'd been out collecting some cash from one of his father's poker machines, while his wife and kids were out at the Jersey Shore. His cousin and a friend were out on the block, and Zatola pulled up and spoke to them out the car window. Ross's driver threw his car in front of Salvatore, who, as he was getting out of his minivan, spotted Ross jump out with a handgun and shoot him once. Salvatore got behind his car and took note of the sedan and its license plate before he tried to run while Ross chased him. He couldn't run, however, due to the pain of the initial shot, so he began rolling around while Ross shot him further. Ross's last bullet grazed Salvatore's head, leading to him blacking out as his would-be killers fled. As his cousin and his friend called 911, Salvatore woke up, told his cousin to get the $1,200 out of his sock from the poker machine, and to tell his family that he loved them. His cousin then got him help, and he was rushed off to the hospital, barely surviving, being shot 7 times.
3189.
the Tierney place in Locust Point. Somebody got shot.
The entire family showed up at the hospital, except for Anthony, his brother, who told the family he was taking his son to a soccer match and couldn't come. Cabby watched news of the shooting on a prison television and realized it had taken place outside the compound he'd been stalking nightly. He then learned from Blanco that Shelton had intended to pay him more than double what he ended up paying, essentially swindling Cabby. He tried talking to Shelton, who began ignoring his calls. The publicity of the family made him worried, and the fact that Shelton was now ghosting him both eventually led to Cabby flipping to the state, testifying to investigators. Police began their case against Shelton, still unknown to them that Anthony Zottola was the one organizing the entire attack.
This is the McDonald's at 1625 Webster Avenue. You can see there is heavy law enforcement presence here. You can also see that it's been blocked off with police tape. This is a drive-through where this man was shot multiple times.
Salvatore, after making a full recovery, sat with his brother to discuss who was coming after them, but Anthony acted like he had no idea. Shelton and Anthony then masterminded a plot to track down Sylvester by placing a tracking device on the bottom of his Acura, which he set up on September 29. 5 days later, on October 4, 2018, at around 5 p.m. that day, Sylvester was tracked to an office near the downtown, where he stayed for a while before leaving and deciding to pull into a McDonald's off of Webster Avenue to get a cup of coffee. Sylvester was at the drive-thru ordering a simple cup of coffee when Ross and a driver in one car sped up in front of him, while a group in another car boxed him in from the side. Ross then leapt out with his handgun drawn and shot Sylvester 5 times in front of the McDonald's drive-thru employees and the manager, killing him right in his car as the 2-vehicle convoy left the scene.
What happened there? Some guy got shot in the parking lot. He looks young. He looks like a black kid.
Sylvester's car lurched forward slowly before bumping into the side of the McDonald's and stopping. As a crowd accumulated around the car, the patriarch of one of New York City's wealthiest families was now dead.
Prosecutors said this photo shows Shells was paid with thousands of dollars tucked between water bottles the day after Sylvester Zottola was killed at McDonald's. They charge Anthony Zottola and Shelton texted about the water bottles. Anthony Zottola was arrested by the FBI 9 months later, right after Father's Day 2019.
Over the next week, theories flew around town. Stories of Banana Mafia murders, Albanian killers, and blood stepping onto Mafia turf began spreading like wildfire, while the Zottola family mourned their father's death and Anthony celebrated behind their backs. Following Sylvester's murder, Anthony called Salvatore and told him that their father had been talking to his girlfriend on the phone when she suddenly heard banging on his end before he hung up and never answered back, leading her to calling Anthony. Meanwhile, 4 minutes after the hit was done, Ross sent a message to Shelton saying done, while Shelton then texted Anthony 4 minutes later telling him, "Can we party today or tomorrow?" referring to when he'd get paid. Anthony sent back saying that it was his son's birthday and that he was taking him to McDonald's, which he loved to eat. He then told Shelton that he'd get him a pack of water bottles, as in his $200,000, for the party tomorrow. He sent Shelton a photo of a box of water bottles hiding $200,000 in cash. Then Shelton responded by telling him that it was like Anthony's birthday as well. With his dad dead, Anthony Zottola took over the family real estate business and got to work instantly, selling off properties and pocketing millions of dollars. On October 11, 2018, police in New York City raided Shelton's home, taking him in and booking him for murder on Cabby's testimony. Raiding his home, they discovered 45 grand in cash and guns, and the mask he'd worn during the first hit attempt back in November of 2017, finding his DNA all over the mask. As a part of their investigation, officers also found the GPS tracker on Sylvester's car, which Ross had failed to remove after killing him. They tracked the SIM card in the device and found the location it had been activated at back on September 29. They used local traffic camera and surveillance footage from the building that day to place Shelton and 5 other Bloods right in their legal crosshairs. Police then took in Ross and several other Bloods, and they then found Shelton's phone. There they saw his messages messages to Anthony Zottola. In the messages, they discovered the image of the box of bottled water, and all of the messages making references to the attacks on his father. On July 17, 2019, Zottola and 9 Bloods, including Blanco, were arrested for the murder of Sylvester and the attempted killing of Salvatore. Upon his arrest, Zottola told police interrogating him that he'd been expecting them for some time.
I had a feeling you were coming. When, I don't know, but I can thank you that it was after Father's Day and it was after all my kids' birthdays. Whatever it is.
Zottola also made a reference to using opioids for back pain.
I usually take those Percocet pills if I can get my hands on something because the pain is just too severe. That's what's in my house.
Prosecutors told a story of a greedy and heartless son who planned to kill off the 2 other men in his family over a period longer than a year, while the defense argued in court that Anthony was a father and family man with chronic back pain who was being taken advantage of by cold and money-hungry gangsters. The messages in Cabby's testimony, however, were too much for the defense. The prosecution was pushing for the death penalty against Zottola and Ross.
We're sitting here, we're given an opportunity to kind of explain what happened that day. An opportunity.
To explain what?
But they ended up dropping it and going with a life sentence. On April 14, 2023, Zottola and Ross got life in prison with an additional 112 years added as a symbolic combination of Sylvester and Salvatore Zottola's ages. The sentence was restricted further with a mandatory no parole order, meaning that both men will spend the rest of their lives in a cell. On June 8, 2023, Shelton got 37 years for murder conspiracy after pleading guilty to attempting to kill Sylvester and his oldest son, while Blanco got 20 years and Cabby disappeared into witness protection.
In court, prosecutors say former mob boss Luigi Baby Shacks Minacchio forced the owners of the Cadillac Lounge to hire Cardillo, who then assisted in getting protection payments to the mob boss.
Boss is now being housed at a prison in Pennsylvania to serve out his sentence for racketeering conspiracy.
Government says you want Bobby DeLuca dead. Did they have that right? Right. That's all.
St. Laurent's most recent prison stint was a 7-year sentence for twice attempting to hire hitmen to kill rival mobster Robert Bobby DeLuca. The
victim there, identified now as 37-year-old Napoleon Andrade, was found dead Sunday on Slater Street. He was serving time in connection to a home invasion from 2010. The house he broke into at the time belonged to an associate of the Gambino crime family in New York.
It's the morning of March 10, 2019 in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. A former bouncer with a lengthy criminal rap sheet is leaving a halfway home he'd been staying at for the last few months, but it would be the last time he'd ever leave the building. A group in a Honda Accord had been stalking him that morning, while the cameras on the outside of the building were turned off. The Accord then pulled up by the home, and someone inside shot the bouncer dead at 9:30 a.m. Police come to learn within the day that their victim is 37-year-old Napoleon Andrade, a former bouncer at a mafia-operated strip club. They'd also soon come to learn that Andrade had gotten himself tangled up in a web of underworld conspiracies that stretched far beyond Pawtucket and into Providence, Boston, and the small towns between them that make up a major portion of New England. Andrade was a close associate of a 100-year-old criminal organization in New England named the Patriarca Mafia family, specifically an employee of the family's boss, Luigi Minacchio. Andrade wasn't just any bouncer. He was a drug trafficker who'd gotten close to Minacchio over the years and got himself mixed up in a big mess with a Connecticut mafia killer named Nicola Melia. But Melia would get his revenge almost a decade later. What started as an argument between two gangsters would lead to a violent holdup, expose traitors within Andrade's circle, and more importantly, bring the secretive, forgotten Rhode Island underworld to light. A criminal landscape made up of violent drug dealers, killers, and businessmen, all answering to a century-old hierarchy of senior citizens.
Everything is fine. I just can't walk now. If I could be walking, I wouldn't be talking about.
80-year-old men who looked old and frail on the outside, but had histories of theft, violence, and cold-blooded murder trailing behind them.
It's Tuesday night at Carmen's Kitchen, a restaurant in East Boston.
Inside at a table in the back are the men who now run the mafia for all of New England. There's the new boss, veteran Boston gangster Peter Lamoni. To his right, Bobby DeLuca, up from Providence. He's the new underboss. And here's Anthony D'Annunzio, a mafia captain and key member of Lamoni's inner circle. The mobsters gathered at Carmen's kitchen after attending a wake for the mother of another mafia captain held just around the corner. The meeting is visual evidence of the new order in the New England mob.
The Rhode Island underworld in the early 2000s was made up of a number of elderly Italian gang bosses who ran crews of dealers, enforcers, and debt collectors out on the streets. Unlike a lot of mafia organizations across the country, the bosses in Providence got their hands dirty and were actively involved in things from home invasions to murders, well into their 80s and even 90s. The New England Mafia has a history of being one of the most violent criminal organizations in the country, once led by their longtime boss, Raymond Petriarca.
When this is over with and really lay the law down, what's going on in this country? It's none but a lot of hookwick that you people have been giving me for a long time.
Petriarca was a thief and killer who rose to the role of mafia boss before he was 50. For the longest time, criminal operations in New England were all controlled by gangsters in Boston. But Petriarca moved things down to Providence, Rhode Island, where he used armed thugs to steamroll local gangsters and began murdering anyone who didn't side with him. Back in 1966, Petriarca murdered bookmaker Willie Marfeo, one of several local criminals who refused to comply with his new mafia organization, and was shot dead in a phone booth one night. Marfeo's brother Rudy and his bodyguard Anthony Millay began the process of forming their own gang, forcing bookmakers who worked for Petriarca to pay them street tribute or risk violence. They also began planning to get revenge for Willie, and Petriarca had to put an end to it. Luigi Manocchio, then 41, planned a double homicide at a Providence supermarket Marfeo shopped at every Saturday like clockwork. Manocchio was a gunman and a mafia soldier who was known to be a playboy and had an affair with Petriarca's personal doctor, Dr. Barbara Roberts. On the afternoon of Saturday, April 20, 1968, Manocchio's crew, led by hitman John Kelly, ambushed Marfeo and Mele at the store, shot them dead inside, and escaped quickly without police catching them. In 1969, however, Kelly and another New England hitman, Joe Barboza, both became police informants and indicted Manocchio, Petriarca, and the rest of the murder crew. Police approached Manocchio, who dressed and acted as a woman to evade them, and then went on the run. Over the next 11 years, Manocchio lived in France and in New York City undercover. In 1983, he choosably turned himself in and got 2 life sentences, but the case was overturned when it was revealed that Kelly's testimonies were mostly lies. After getting out of prison, Manocchio started a robbery ring, stealing $10 million over the years, and in 1999 got 3 years probation when he admitted that the kitchen appliances in his mother's home were all stolen. By then, he was the boss of the Providence Mafia and ran the sprawling criminal enterprise out of a humble apartment above a laundromat. In the early 2000s, Manocchio had a crew working for him, and a lot of them were struggling to make money. Matthew Guglielmetti, born in 1948, became Manocchio's second in command, taking the place of Eddie Latto, who was growing too old for the job. Guglielmetti was a drug trafficker who got into the gang through his father, Matthew Sr. In 2002, federal agents launched a fake construction company in Johnston, Rhode Island, where Guglielmetti had influence as a member of the Laborers International Union of North America. He was approached by undercover agents acting as company representatives, bought his way into the company as a silent partner, and was observed for years using the company for money laundering. Guglielmetti was laundering cocaine money in the thousands. He and Manocchio were overheard on FBI wiretaps talking about mafia violence and gambling debts. And on January 20, 2005, agents raided Capital City Concrete in Cranston, Rhode Island, and arrested Guglielmetti for trying to move 4 kilos of cocaine from Rhode Island to Canada. He pleaded guilty and got 11 years. Meanwhile, Manocchio noticed a vulnerability in Rhode Island's strip club market, one he could easily take advantage of to extort Providence strip clubs out out of millions of dollars, while he began putting together a ring to shake down local businesses. Other gangsters like Vincent Tootsie Tallow and Anthony the Saint Laurent were running their own crews and kicking up hundreds of thousands of dollars to Minocchio. Anthony Saint Laurent was a career criminal who never even thought to go straight across his life. His gang was a family affair. His son Anthony Jr. and wife Dorothy both helped him run an extortion ring in Taunton, Massachusetts, where rival gangster Robert DeLuca also ran a crew. DeLuca was a killer from Providence who was made in the late 1980s after helping end a vicious mafia war between Boston and Providence. DeLuca and Saint Laurent had issues that eventually rose into DeLuca publicly calling Saint Laurent a rat in early 2006 and spreading the rumor to others in their circle.
The government says you want Bobby DeLuca dead. Do they have that right? Right. That's all.
St. Laurent's most recent prison stint was a 7-year sentence for twice attempting to hire hitmen to kill rival mobster Robert Bobby DeLuca. The two had a long simmering feud.
Saint Laurent allegedly then got permission from Minocchio to murder DeLuca. On April 12, Saint Laurent met with Taunton gangster Anthony Nardolillo over in neighboring Rhode Island. Saint Laurent drove the hitman into Providence that night to show him a restaurant DeLuca always dined at, named the Sidebar Bistro. For payment, he told the hitman that he planned to pay him using money from bookmakers who were paying DeLuca, since DeLuca would be killed and Saint Laurent would take his business. While in prison in Fort Devens, wearing an oxygen mask and confined to a wheelchair, Saint Laurent got into contact with Nardolillo and fellow gangster Ricky Silva, who began discussing killing DeLuca, but Nardolillo wasn't who he seemed.
You went to the restaurant when you put it? Excuse me? You put me phone, right? Yeah. You went to the restaurant then? I'm gonna let go I just, only white. I think he says, Bobby DeLuca's a little guy. Bobby DeLuca's a little. No repercussion. In other words, we don't want to have a problem with that. But we don't want to have a problem with Louis. No repercussion. If you want, after it's done, I'll take it. Okay, don't leave it. What? If you want to let the Louis, you take you on, I'll go. I'll take it right home. To make sure we don't have a repercussion. And my voice should be good enough. Oh, no, it isn't. Everything is fine. I just can't walk with him. If I could be walking, I wouldn't be talking about.
He was wearing a federal wiretap throughout their conversations in prison and on the streets with Silva. While out on a drive, Silva told Nardolillo he didn't feel safe killing DeLuca for just $20,000, since DeLuca was a made member of the Mafia. He then told Nardolillo, ironically, that he thought Saint Laurent was a rat.
What's up, these motherfuckers ain't trying to trap us? That's another reason. I'll tell you what, if they do, I hope they're not their mother's only children.
The plot wouldn't materialize since the government had been recording every conversation between the trio. In 2007, Saint Laurent pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder and got 10 years in prison. Ironically, DeLuca would later become a federal informant.
To those court documents obtained by Target 12, DeLuca and Minocchio arranged protection payments for local strip clubs to the tune of $4,000 to $6,000 a month. DeLuca was charged with RICO conspiracy, but signed a plea agreement pledging to cooperate with federal investigators. In that plea deal, the government acknowledged the danger DeLuca faced by cooperating with federal agents, saying he had the option to enter the witness protection program.
Meanwhile, Minocchio had things going out on the street. In 2002, Minocchio, Thomas Iafrate, Alfred Scivola Jr., and Edward Latto began forcing Providence strip clubs to pay them protection money, while Latto, Scivola Jr., Frank, Bobo Marapese, and Vincent Tallow were running a 24-man crew to take illegal sports bets in Rhode Island. As like any other criminal betting ring, players put money down on the odds, and if they lost, were scared into paying off their debts. At the center center of their crew was Tootsie Tallow. Tallow was a local criminal who illegally sold prescription drugs and guns from his home in Johnston, Rhode Island. Marapese was one of the state's biggest criminals. He had ties to the Patriarca family going all the way back to the 60s, and in that time had grown ties to Providence motorcycle clubs and street gangsters. Back in 1975, Marapese had taken his first life, that of Richard Dicky Calle, a friend of the Mafia who was shot dead at a social club owned by Marapese's father. Throughout the 1980s, Marapese stole in the millions, taking asphalt from the city to start a paving company and hijacking Lazy Boy truck shipments on their way to stores so that he could resell their couches. In May of 1982, Marapese shot down Mafia member Anthony Marabella at a restaurant on Valley Street, and in August of that year beat a 20-year-old civilian named Ronald McElroy to death in the middle of the road after McElroy had cut Marapese off. In 1987, he was charged for the murder of Dicky Calle, but got out in April of 2008, the perfect time to get out and get involved in illegal gambling. Things were shaking up in Providence that year. Minocchio was getting payments from the Cadillac Lounge, the Foxy Lady, and the Satin Doll strip clubs. Minocchio forced the owners of the strip clubs, all three owned by the same group of businessmen, to put his own employees in charge of the bookkeeping. Thomas Efrare, Theodore Cardillo, and Richard Bonafilia were all put in charge of various roles at these clubs, Cardillo becoming the general manager of the Cadillac Lounge. Also involved in the scheme was Anthony D'Annunzio, a senior gang leader from North End Boston, who ran the neighborhood with his brother Carmen D'Annunzio. Nearing the end of 2009, Minocchio decided to retire from his position as boss of the Patriarca family. Although he continued to lead Providence, the new boss became Peter Lamona, an elderly gangster who just gotten out of a 30-year prison sentence for murder when it was exposed that he was framed for the crime by government witness Joe Barboza. In 2009, Lamona was arrested for extortion, and Anthony D'Annunzio became the new family boss of New England. He and Cardillo began making millions from the strip club scheme, as did Minocchio, who netted some $1 million over the years.
37-year-old Napoleon Andrade was no stranger to law enforcement. Over the years, he's been arrested by police in North Providence, Pawtucket, multiple times in Providence, as well as the state police and the FBI.
Well, he's an enforcer. He's the type of person when he shows up at your door, you're going to do what you're asked to do.
Retired State Police Colonel Stephen O'Donnell, a veteran mob investigator, says Andrade was associated with former New England mob boss Luigi Baby Shax Minocchio.
Which was unusual. You know, a mob boss trusting someone outside of the mob family, but those relationships developed over years, and Louis Minocchio trusted him.
Napoleon Andrade was involved personally with Minocchio as his bodyguard. Andrade was a gangster from Central Falls, a densely populated city within Pawtucket, Rhode Island, that holds a higher crime rate than the rest of the state. In the 2000s, Central Falls was a dense, corrupt prison city, home to numerous gangs and street toughs like Andrade. Andrade worked as a bouncer at the clubs Minocchio shook down, and the two likely came into contact around 2007 or 2006. They worked together for years until Minocchio trusted Andrade enough to make him his driver and bodyguard. In 2008, police began monitoring Andrade as he attempted to steal and sell drugs across Pawtucket. In December of 2009, ATF agents posed as buyers who purchased $1,000 worth of marijuana from Andrade inside of a Central Falls apartment and observed another 15 bags of marijuana inside. In December of 2009, Andrade was lured to a storage unit in northern Providence that agents had rented out and filled with illegal cigarettes. Andrade had purchased a set of bolt cutters and planned a robbery. Him and the agent then busted into the small garage and got $30,000 worth of cigarettes from it. In January of the following year, Andrade told an undercover agent that he'd hidden a kilo of cocaine under a treadmill at his apartment building gym, which the agents then recovered and confirmed the presence of. In April, Andrade planned a robbery at a Connecticut home of someone that he knew had a kilogram of cocaine. He approached an informant with the ATF and provided him with a .357 caliber to break in and steal the drugs from the home, but the robbery never happened. In March of 2010, ATF agents planted a vehicle in Central Falls with 100 grams of crack cocaine, stolen jewelry, and $500 in cash, and an undercover agent lured him to the car and got him to break in. Minocchio put Andrade to work as well, getting him to collect extortion payments from the clubs he bounced at. An issue formed around that same time with other gangsters near Providence, Nicola Melia and Gennaro Miele. Melia was a Connecticut-based member of the Ndrangheta, a widespread Calabrian criminal organization with ties all over the world. Melia, then 78, was the brother of Vincenzo Melia, another Connecticut Calabrian who tried to murder his girlfriend back in the 80s, returned to Italy, and formed the Sacra Corona criminal network. In 2012, Vincenzo Melia was overheard by police declaring himself more powerful than God, arrested soon after for drug trafficking, and died in police custody. Miele and Melia had problems over a $300,000 loan sharking debt owed by Melia. On the morning of March 8, 2010, Miele drove Andrade and Mafia member Stephen Conti to Melia's North Stamford home. Andrade posed as a delivery man as Melia opened the door, and he then tackled the 78-year-old gangster to the floor, tied him, and blindfolded him. As the trio raided the home and stole $216,000 worth of cash and jewels, and a shotgun. Before they left, Melia asked them to leave a couple bucks so he could get Starbucks later. Another plot formed in 2010 with a marijuana dealer named Raymond Jenkins, a member of the Mafia, who was involved in extorting a car salesman. The salesman owed a debt to another gangster, which he'd borrowed after defrauding his employer, and needed Jenkins' help. Jenkins agreed to organize a payment system, but the salesman couldn't come up with the money. Albino Folgarelli, another old gangster, then went to the business, but the salesman wasn't there, and when his co-workers called him to tell him to stay away from the dealership, he panicked and paid $25,000 from his wife's retirement savings.
The plea deal may have spared Folgarelli a life sentence. Target 12 has learned the longtime criminal may have been a candidate for a federal career offender law, a law designed to keep bad guys off the streets forever. Albino Folgarelli is no stranger to law enforcement. Records show the 54-year-old has been convicted at least 6 times for serious crimes, ranging from assault with a dangerous weapon to drug dealing. We've uncovered he's been in and out of prison for the last 30 years. This is an ACI mugshot from several years ago. Here's a Johnston police booking photo for a domestic violence charge, which was eventually dismissed. Prosecutors say he has been a longtime associate of the New England mob, and it was his life of crime that may have played a major role in signing off on a plea deal. On Tuesday, Folgarelli pledged to plead guilty to extortion conspiracy. The plea deal obtained by Target 12 means that Folgarelli could see about 10 years in prison, but that's a whole lot less than a potential life sentence he could receive under a habitual offender law. The law requires 2 other violent crimes or drug offenses before the harsh sentence is imposed. Investigators say Folgarelli and 2 other defendants, Capo Regime Edward Eddie Lato and mob associate Raymond Scarface Jenkins, extorted $25,000 from a Johnston used car salesman.
In a simpler time, men with Sicilian surnames and sharkskin suits were the very embodiment of domestic terror in blue-collar neighborhoods, even the corridors of power. But today brought proof that La Cosa Nostra is not quite ready for museum mothballs. It was a roundup of so many alleged Goodfellas, the feds used an army base to hold them all. So what is the state of the modern mafia, and is it anything close to the brand made famous by Brando?
Police eventually put together a case against Minocchio, the 2 crews he oversaw in Providence, and some 120 gangsters in a huge East Coast mafia bust that stretched from Florida to New Hampshire. The raids took place in January of 2011, Minocchio being caught in Fort Lauderdale and extradited north. The charges in New York City included 2 gangland murders, one during a robbery gone wrong, and the other in a bar after one gangster spilled another one's drink. Also arrested was Andrade, charged with drug trafficking. In 2012, Minocchio pleaded guilty to extortion and got 5.5 years behind bars. He told the court, quote, "By virtue of my position, I inherited the deeds of my associates. I simply do not want my family or friends to believe I personally threatened anybody." During the case, numerous friends of Minocchio came to the court for his support, with only good things to say about him. They portrayed him as a fit, healthy old man who kept local kids away from crime and donated to the needy, while the prosecution portrayed him as a killer with a life of crime under his belt, stealing from strip clubs to pocket small sums of cash in a dying criminal market. Scivola, Iafrate, Lato, and Tallo were all named in the indictment as well, and all pleaded guilty to minor sentences, each getting a few years behind bars. Andrade, meanwhile, pleaded guilty to drug trafficking and got a decade in prison. Melia got 5 years for extortion, Frank Bobo Marapese got 9 years for extortion and blackmail and passed away at the Adult Correctional Institution in 2017. Meanwhile, the case against the home invasion plot began to materialize in 2014 when Stephen Conti began wearing a wire against Gennaro Miele. Miele told Conti on wiretap that he better not rat against him and tried intimidating him into not cooperating with law enforcement. On September 1st, 2014, Miele pleaded guilty to home invasion and got 41 months in jail, while Andrade got 63. On November 4, 2015, Minocchio was released from the halfway house he was staying in, and just a few years later, Andrade was released into a halfway home in Pawtucket. That brings us back to the beginning of this video, March 10, 2019. On that day, Andrade exited the front entrance of his halfway home like any other day, only this time, the security cameras were switched off. As he walked outside, a stolen Honda Accord drove up in the snow, and shooters in the car shot Andrade dead outside the home before speeding off. Andrade was shot dead at 9:30 a.m. and stayed lying in the snow for 4 hours before cops pulled up on the scene.
Police say he was an inmate at the home serving out the final months of his federal prison sentence. He was serving time in connection to a home invasion from 2010. The house he broke into at the time belonged to an associate of the Gambino crime family in New York. Pawtucket police believe yesterday's shooting was not random.
To this day, it's unknown who shot him, who ordered it, and what the motive was, but the most accepted theory was that it was a violent gangland retribution for the home invasion on Melia's property 9 years prior, and that, to some capacity, corrupt local police officers were involved. On December 8, 2024, Minocchio passed away from natural causes at the age of 97, an entire century spent within the gritty and bloody world of organized crime in Rhode Island. As a side note, Frank Marapese's son, Frank Marapese Jr., pleaded guilty this year to the 2019 torture and murder of his ex-girlfriend, Lauren Issei, at her Cranston, Rhode Island apartment. Marapese Jr. will spend the rest of his life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Howard Beach residents say they feel they're under siege. 5 homes in 5 days targeted by criminals.
I'm gonna fucking murder you, bitch. You watch. You fucking piece of shit. I did not see you. What the fuck is wrong with you, bro?
Richard hacked by federal court today after putting his mother's house up as part of a bail package. Caught up in a sweeping organized crime indictment that includes alleged co-conspirators charged with assault and a decades-old loan sharking business.
His net worth was worth $35 million. Ronnie had over $3 million in street loan shark money. He's one of the biggest earners for the Banana family. He lived in a $3.2 million mansion on the corner. I'm in Lindenwood. I never forget this day till I'm dead, because it's April 2006, first time I ever shot somebody. And actually shot someone, you know what I mean?
It's June 28, 2006, in Howard Beach, Queens. Chris Cañada, a local drug dealer in his early 20s, is hiding out at a family home north of the neighborhood. Cañada had gone to war with one of the area's most violent crews, a mafia cell led by Ronnie G. Gelanzo. Gelanzo was the head of a small crew of drug dealers, loan sharks, gambling czars, thieves, and killers, owing his position to not only his muscle and reputation in the street, but also his blood relation to famous mafia captain Vinny Azzaro, being Azzaro's nephew. Azzaro was a captain in the Bonanno family, one of New York City's most powerful mafia organizations with ties to Sicily and Montreal. Things had escalated between Gelanzo and Cañada after Cañada hit Gelanzo's drug supplies on numerous occasions. A shooting took place in a parking lot, a stash house was robbed, and gunshots exploded from there. Early that morning, 4 members of Gelanzo's crew met with Gelanzo to pull a hit on Cañada outside the safe house. Gelanzo and another mobster, Michael Padavona, got into one car, while Gene Borello and 2 drug dealers got into another car. Both vehicles pulled up outside of the home and waited as Cañada and a relative stepped into a car out on the curb. The hit car then pulled up beside their victim, and Cañada watched as Borello aimed a handgun right at face level in broad daylight. It wouldn't be the first nor the last time that Cañada had a gun stuck in his face. The story of the Gelanzo crew was one of high stakes, fast money, and ultimately poor decision making that led to numerous men being thrown behind bars for a majority of their lives. Vincent Azzaro was born in 1937 in Ozone Park, New York. From an early age, he was introduced to the world of organized crime through his father and uncle-in-law, who were already involved in the Bonanno crime family. These men were related by blood to the gang's original founder, Joe Bonanno. Ozone Park, located in the borough of Queens, had long been a hub for organized crime, and the Bonanno family, one of the most powerful mafia organizations in the city, had deep roots in the area. Growing up in this environment, Azzaro's path into the criminal underworld seemed almost inevitable. His father and uncle were both entrenched in the family. From a young age, Azzaro was exposed to the criminal dealings that would shape his life. The Bonanno crime family, one of the notorious 5 families of New York, controlled much of the city's legal operations. They were involved in a wide range of criminal activities, making them a formidable force in the city's underworld for a number of decades. Azzaro's early years were marked by his deep integration into this mafia family, and it wasn't long before he began to make a name for himself within the organization. His connections afforded him certain privileges, but he proved himself to be a capable and ambitious man. Azzaro's rise through the ranks of the Bonanno family was steady. By the mid-1970s, he had earned the prestigious rank of captain, or caporegime. Captains within the mafia played a crucial role in maintaining the organization's operations. In the past, they were known as capodecina, as in a man who led a 10-person crew. They were responsible for overseeing crews of soldiers and associates, ensuring that the rackets ran smoothly while isolating the top leadership from the street-level activities. In 1969, Azzaro and Irish gangster Jimmy Burke became suspicious that a man named Paul Katz, who owned a warehouse where they stored stolen goods, was cooperating with law enforcement after a raid on the property. According to later testimony from Gaspare Valenti, Azzaro's cousin and future government witness, Burke strangled Katz with a dog chain while Azzaro stood by and watched. Once he was dead, Azzaro and Burke buried the body in the basement of a vacant home in Queens. For years, the murder remained unsolved, with Katz's body hidden away, and the men went about their business with no further interruptions. By the late 1970s, Azzaro was involved in one of the most notorious and audacious crimes in New York's history, the Lufthansa heist.
And the law enforcement officers say that it was carried off with such precision and such daring, you almost have to consider it an inside job. Here's Anthony Preisenbuch.
The heist, which took place on December 11, 1978, was one of the largest cash thefts in US history. Burke, known for his wits in theft, planned the heist, and he assembled a crew of experienced criminals, including Azzaro, to carry it out. Although the heist was a success for the gangsters, it would go on to haunt many of those involved. Most of the participants would end up being slaughtered by Burke's crew, while the survivors never received their full share of the money. The paranoia and greed that followed the heist led to a series of violent betrayals within the criminal underworld. Azzaro, like many others, felt shortchanged. In a conversation later recorded by federal investigators, Azzaro lamented, quote, "We never got our right money. That fucking Jimmy kept everything." The murder of Paul Katz and the Lufthansa heist both added to the growing federal interest in Azzaro. He wasn't some simple street-level drug dealer. He was a captain who led an experienced crew. However, neither crime would resurface until decades later. In 2013, the FBI executed a search warrant on the Queens property where Paul Katz's body was buried. The property had once been owned by the Burke family, and investigators, acting on information from informants, dug up the basement where they discovered the remnants of Katz's body. DNA testing confirmed his identity, and for the first time in over 40 years, law enforcement had concrete evidence linking Azzaro and Burke to the crime. The discovery, along with mounting evidence from other investigations, placed Azzaro firmly in the crosshairs of law enforcement. In January of 2014, he was arrested and charged with racketeering conspiracy, including his role in the heist and Katz's murder. It was time for the government to make a return on their decades of surveillance. At Azzaro's trial, the prosecution leaned heavily on the testimony of his cousin Gaspare Valenti, who had just turned government witness in 2008. Valenti testified that Azzaro had recruited him for the Lufthansa job and expressed deep frustration over not receiving his full share of the money. Additionally, Valenti provided crucial information about Katz's murder, confirming Azzaro's role. Despite the seemingly damning testimony, however, Azzaro's defense team was able to discredit Valenti's character. They claimed that he had exaggerated or fabricated aspects of the story in exchange for leniency from the government, and their strategy worked. In a surprising turn of events, the jury acquitted Azzaro of all charges related to Lufthansa heist and Katz's murder, only 1 year after his arrest.
I just want to repeat, I'd like to thank my 2 lawyers. Without them, I wouldn't be here now. Okay. And I'd like to thank the U.S. Marshal Service for treating me great.
Though he managed to avoid prison in 2015, his criminal career was far from over. Just 2 years later, in 2017, Azzaro was back in court for a bizarre and violent road rage incident that showcased his quiet and active involvement in organized crime. In 2012, Azzaro had been cut off in traffic in Ozone Park. His response was anything but ordinary. Furious over the perceived slight, Azzaro orchestrated an arson attack on the offending driver's car, getting together a crew to do the job. The crew comprised of Howard Beach dealers John J. Gotti, the grandnephew of former Mafia boss John Gotti, and Gene Borello, a local thief. They tracked down the driver's address using his license plate number and bombed the car in his driveway. In court, Azzaro brazenly admitted to ordering the attack, stating, "I made arrangements for someone to take care of it, and it was done." This time, there would be no acquittal. Azzaro pleaded guilty to the charges of arson and was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. As Vincent Azzaro's criminal career was winding down, his nephew, Ronnie G. Giallanzo, was rapidly rising through the ranks of the Bonanno family and took his spot as he aged behind bars. Born into a world of organized crime, Giallanzo's path into the family business was almost predestined. With Azzaro as his uncle and other powerful relatives deeply involved in mafia operations, Giallanzo grew up immersed in the criminal culture that permeated Howard Beach, Queens. Howard Beach had long been an area obsessed with gang culture. The hood was bordered to the north by Ozone Park, and for the longest time had been a breeding ground of mafia activity. While the mafia fell out of public favor in many areas of the country, the residents of Howard Beach still respected and supported the mafia and had a vehement hatred for mafia rats. By the early 2000s, Giallanzo had established himself as a significant player in the Bonanno family's Howard Beach operations, becoming an acting captain following his uncle's arrest. As a captain, he oversaw various hustles, including drugs, loan sharking, extortion, and gambling. At some point, he had millions of dollars out on the streets in loans. His loan sharking operation was particularly lucrative, bringing in millions of dollars over the years. Giallanzo had adopted the sports betting operation from his cousin, Giacomo Bonventre. Bonventre was a member of the Bonanno family's Bonventre clan, one of the longest leading clans in the family, connected heavily through intermarriage to the original administration. Giacomo, a Howard Beach gangster, had, like his cousin Giallanzo, grown up in the gang, and was even proposed to become the family's top advisor, but turned down the role. In 2007, he received 9 months in prison and a 3-year supervised release period following, and his profitable business was passed to his cousin Giallanzo. In 2015, he received an additional 21 months in jail for collecting a loan sharking debt. The terms of repayment were unforgiving, and those who failed to meet Giallanzo's demands often faced violent consequences. One case that stood out involved a loan shark who owed Giallanzo a staggering $250,000. The shark had taken a loan to fund a home renovation project, but when he failed to repay the loan on time, Giallanzo's associates beat him so severely that he soiled himself out of fear and physical pain. Giallanzo's crew was made up of a small circle of loyal and vicious enforcers. This included Nicholas Festa, not a tough guy, but a drug dealer who managed the day-to-day logistics of Giallanzo's sport betting ring and made millions of dollars. Then there was Michael Palmaccio, a key lieutenant in Giallanzo's crew, who was deeply involved in both loan sharking and extortion. He was inducted into the Bonanno family back in 2002, and in 2011 he was charged and arrested for running an illegal internet gambling site named Arrow Action that made him and his 3 dead enforcers over $8 million. Other members of the crew included Michael Padavona, a drug dealer who was inducted into the family in 2014. He was supposed to be inducted with Giallanzo in 1998, but just before his ceremony, Padavona got into a violent argument with Azzaro that took the men 15 years to get over. Then there was Ricky Kessler, a coke addict and close childhood friend of Giallanzo who used to hang out with him at the Bow Wow, a deli and seafood bar in Old Howard Beach, where the teenage pair spent their days at the diner's popular game room. There was also Robert Pisani, an associate of Giallanzo's crew, who owned the Queens Bagel Shop where he ran his racketeering business. Richard Heck, a drug distributor. Gene Borello, a dealer and career thief who got his start in home invasion. And Chris Cañada, a local drug dealer nicknamed Crazy. Beyond loan sharking, Giallanzo was involved in violent feuds with his rivals. One particularly notorious conflict involved Cañada at the center, resulting in a series of shootings in the Howard Beach area. At some point in 2005, Festa approached Giallanzo and complained about Cagnata robbing his drug supplies on numerous occasions. Cagnata denied the accusation, but Giallanzo was furious and answered by ordering he be taught a lesson, hiring out Borello via email to non-fatally shoot the robber. The hunt for Cagnata was on. On one occasion, Giallanzo was out with Padavona, Palmaccio and Borello sitting in the back. The group drove up by where they believed Cagnata lived, and Palmaccio and Borello stepped out into the street. Giallanzo gave the pair guns that they hid in the wheel wells of cars parked on the street, but after a few hours of waiting outside with no action, Giallanzo got them and the guns and left. As the conflict unfolded, Giallanzo had actually been on a pre-trial supervised release over an unrelated matter. An officer pulled him over for speeding as he was actively going to meet with his pre-trial services officer in Brooklyn. Sitting in the backseat of his Mercedes was a handgun, openly on the seat, but the officer hadn't noticed it as he ticketed the gangster. Later, Borello was out by his apartment complex when he spotted Cagnata sitting with his girl in her car nearby. Borello then pulled out his gun and opened fire, grazing Cagnata's arm as his girlfriend hit the gas, striking Borello as the pair got out of the area. Giallanzo, however, was happy with the shooting as his goal had been met. Cagnata had been properly scared and injured, and the men decided to keep hitting. He sent his crew out to firebomb Cagnata's girlfriend's car as revenge for speeding into Borello. One night following the shooting, Festa, Borello, and a third man broke down the door to Cagnata's drug stash, robbed the scene, and began speeding away, followed by Cagnata. Borello began opening fire on the rival gangster, leading to him cutting the chase off. That same night, Cagnata approached the third man's home, where the mafioso lived with his children, and shot at the home, hitting the door twice, but hurting no one inside. The street war only got worse following an excited phone call held at Padavona's boathouse, sitting at the Howard Beach Marina. Over the phone, Giallanzo angrily argued with Cagnata about the violence between them. When Cagnata escalated the call, he held his handgun up to the phone speaker, cocked the gun, and threatened to kill Giallanzo's wife and kids. He then closed the line, and Giallanzo decided Cagnata couldn't be reasoned with. One of his men learned of Cagnata's whereabouts, a family home in Lindenwood, just north of Howard Beach, and Giallanzo's crew got ready to take a life. On the morning of June 28, 2006, Padavona met with 3 men, Borello and 2 drug dealers, and gave the men guns. The trio then hopped into a car while Padavona and Giallanzo got into another one. The hit convoy left Howard Beach and drove up to Lindenwood, the hit crew parking a block north of the home, and Padavona parking close by, just in case. The crew waited for a bit until Cagnata and a family member exited the abode. They got into a car, started the ignition, and left the block. Borello following them closely. Suddenly, the hit car pulled up next to Cagnata's vehicle, and Borello opened fire numerous times. The trio sped off, going to meet with Giallanzo and Padavona. Giallanzo got the gun from Borello, threw it over a nearby bridge, and the men quickly fled the area. However, Cagnata wasn't quite dead yet, and instead of the war ending with his death, it ended with his arrest. In September of that same year, Cagnata was arrested for a stabbing, charged with assault, while Giallanzo was arrested for violating the terms of his pre-trial release due to a meeting with a mafia associate in November. Even when Giallanzo faced legal troubles and brief stints in prison, his grip on Howard Beach remained firm. After getting out in 2013, he met with Cagnata, and the two amicably agreed to squash their beef. Cagnata returning to his drug racket and Giallanzo to his crew. The steady flow of illegal profits allowed Giallanzo to maintain a lavish lifestyle, and one of the most ostentatious symbols of his wealth was a sprawling mansion in Howard Beach. After getting out of jail, and when he replaced his uncle Azzaro in 2014, he had the mansion built over an old property, adorned with windows all over the massive brick home. With no registered income to his name, the mansion instantly became a target of the feds. As a result, Giallanzo's criminal career began to unravel in the mid-2010s, as federal authorities intensified their investigation into his activities.
Richard hacked by federal court today after putting his mother's house up as part of a bail package, caught up in a sweeping organized crime indictment that includes alleged co-conspirators charged with assault and a decades-old loan sharking business.
I think this is another one of these cases where the government in the Eastern District of New York has bitten off more that they can chew. I mean, we saw this with Mr. Assaro's case, in which there was a total acquittal.
Years of surveillance, informants, and undercover operations finally bore fruit, and by 2017, the FBI had gathered enough evidence to take down Giallanzo and several of his associates. Following the bust-up of their crew, Kessler flipped to the state, and so did Borello. Gene Borello had once been a thief within the Bonanno family, leading a violent home invasion crew responsible for a series of robberies across New York and Florida. The crew targeted wealthy individuals, often tying up and beating their victims before stealing large sums of cash, jewelry, and valuables and fleeing the scene. When he wasn't robbing homes, he was out in the streets beating down debtors and collecting payments for Ronnie G. In the early 2000s, Borello had been locked up at Rikers Island, where he managed to unite with members of a New York street gang for protection. And after getting out in 2010, Gialenzo immediately got Borello back to work. He clicked up with his cousin, a drug dealer who had been unknowingly dealing with an undercover cop, using his baby's backpack as a cover for the drugs. Actually carrying his baby during the drug deals made the backpack a believable cover-up for anyone looking a little too close. Borello was back to work, collecting debts and shooting Gialenzo's enemies, Gialenzo often giving him instructions over email. In the early 2010s, a spike of vicious home robberies hit the Howard Beach area, led by Borello. His cousin, however, was eventually nabbed after making over 21 deals with the undercover cop. He decided to flip on Borello. For over a year, he collected wiretap recordings of his crimes with his cousin. In one case, Borello and his cousin were out to shoot someone on Gialenzo's orders, and Borello even gave his cousin the gun to hide. When the NYPD caught up to Borello in 2014, he chose to cooperate with the FBI rather than face decades behind bars. The day he was caught up, he left his cousin's house to go to a wedding, when armed police swamped him and took him in. They named him in a whole slew of cases, including a home invasion in Florida, which they used to deny him bail as an interstate fugitive. Meanwhile, Ricky Kessler had secretly begun cooperating with the FBI almost a year before Borello, providing key information about Gialenzo's criminal activities. Kessler's testimony helped paint a picture of Gialenzo as a ruthless mobster from a working-class hood and a criminal bloodline. He gave testimony regarding the hits on Cañada, a young and aggressive man who'd been involved in crime since he was a little kid. Borello's testimony was instrumental in the government's case against Gialenzo. He provided detailed accounts of Gialenzo's loan sharking operation, describing how the gangster used violence to enforce debts and intimidate his enemies. At the heart of their 2017 indictment was Gialenzo's lucrative loan sharking operation, which reportedly brought in over $26 million over the course of nearly 2 decades. The operation catered to a wide range of borrowers, including business owners, gamblers, and others who found themselves in dire financial straits. The terms were predatory, with interest rates reaching as high as 50% in some cases, ensuring that the debtors would remain trapped in a cycle of repayment. Alongside his loan sharking business, Gialenzo operated a highly profitable sports betting ring. This operation, which ran continuously for years, generated thousands of dollars in revenue every day. He and his crew set the odds, collected debts, and paid out the winnings, all the while skimming a significant portion of the profit for themselves. As the trial approached, the weight of the RICO charges against Gialenzo and his crew became clear. They'd been following him for years and used information from Kessler and Borello to build a case focused on loan sharking, drug dealing, arson, and attempted murder. Gialenzo's grip on his criminal empire began to falter, signaling the downfall of one of the family's most prominent figures.
The publisher of a community newspaper in Queens is arrested by FBI agents on witness tampering charges. Agents arrested Patricia Adams, who also goes by Pat, Wednesday morning at her Howard Beach home. Adams is the publisher of The Forum, a community newspaper covering several Southeast Queens neighborhoods. According to a federal complaint, Adams allegedly has a close personal connection with members of the Bonanno organized crime family. She's accused of threatening and intimidating a witness in order to convince them not to testify against a member of that crime family who was accused of sexually assaulting one of his female employees.
At the same time as the trial, Pisani, the bagel shop owner in Gialenzo's crew, was facing legal issues of his own when it was alleged that he groped a female employee at his deli and coerced her into performing sex acts on him. After the employee reported the assault to a cop who'd entered the store one day to get a bagel, Pisani called up Patricia Adams, the founder and main editor of The Forum, a Howard Beach newspaper, and planned a way to silence the employee. Adams often played cards at a Mafia club in Ozone Park, which had caused her to ramp up a steady debt over the years and become indebted to the Mafia through service. Adams met with the employee's dad at a Starbucks in Howard Beach and explained to him that if they took the case to court, she'd smear and slander the woman in the papers and ruin her family's reputation. But her threats didn't work the way Pisani thought it would, and the government came after the pair for threatening the employee and her father. The weight of the evidence against Jalanzo was overwhelming, and in 2018, he pleaded guilty to racketeering conspiracy. In exchange for a lighter sentence, Jalanzo admitted to his involvement in loan sharking, extortion, and violent enforcement tactics. As a part of the plea agreement, Jalanzo was ordered to forfeit $1.25 million in assets, including his prized mansion in Howard Beach. The mansion, built with the proceeds of his empire, was seized and sold off to be paid as legal restitution to his old loan sharking clientele. During his sentencing, Jalanzo showed little remorse for his actions, though he acknowledged that his criminal activities would cause him to miss important events with his family while serving his prison sentence. He expressed no regret. In court, the judge condemned Jalanzo's violent behavior, stating that his actions were reminiscent of mafia movies, but the damage he caused was very real. Jalanzo was sentenced to 14 years in federal prison, a significant blow to the Bonanno family's operations in Howard Beach. Though he would spend the next several years behind bars, his criminal empire had left a lasting impact on the community. Meanwhile, one resident, angry with his arrest, began putting up posters calling Kessler a rat all over the neighborhood. As for Cañada, his fate took a sharp turn on November 22nd, 2016, when he was brutally murdered inside a Lindenwood apartment building. That day, at around 4:30 p.m., the now 30-year-old Cañada drove up to an apartment building on 151st Avenue, where Joseph Amatucho lived. Amatucho was a convicted felon who owed Cañada drug money, but Amatucho wasn't there that day. His girlfriend told Cañada that Amatucho would be back later, and then went out to walk her dog. Later, at around 6:25 p.m., she returned with a male friend, and they saw Cañada still outside, so her friend opened the door and let Cañada in. He shockingly stormed inside the apartment, only to find Amatucho hiding in the bedroom, and the two began a violent fight. Amatucho then whipped out a handgun on the much larger Cañada, and fired on him with the .45 caliber, fatally hitting his neck and chest. Amatucho fled the scene with the friend, leaving his girl to call 911 and report the shooting. At 7:10 p.m. that same night, Cañada passed away at Jamaica Hospital at only 30 years old. Officers found security footage from the building that night of Amatucho running down the stairs and hiding in a 5th-floor apartment unit with his friend, and they stormed inside and arrested him, finding the .45 caliber and taking him into custody.
I want to say I'm home, like I said, about 3 weeks. He goes, Brian Fahey. Goes, he owes me $75,000. He goes, he's not paying. Go see him. I said, all right, he's in the car. He's in the car wash. And I go in there, and his face turns white as a loose leaf paper. He knows why I'm there. And he goes, Gene, he goes, just like this. I never forget it. He goes, don't come here. The feds are watching me. I says, Brian, listen, you know how much you owe. I'm not going to come here again. Make sure the money's paid. I says, he knows the cops ain't want. He just wanted to scare me with the law, so I don't do nothing to him. That's what it was. He didn't have the money. Anyway, long story short, he never pays the money. 3 months later, Ronnie goes, send him a message. I said, all right. I know what he means by sending him a message. I know what he means sending him a message. Gene's back loading up. I'm waiting on this guy for a half hour to close up his fucking car wash so I could shoot this guy. I'm sitting here, half hour, sitting outside, freezing my ass. If I keep going out the car to go inside of his building, going back in the car, I'm like, pull up. I just start fucking shooting at him. I'm supposed to shoot him in the ass. No, I'm shooting at his back now. I was so mad. So, like I said, these are just crazy stories, but this is, on federal paperwork. I was charged with this, obviously, and I ended up putting like 3 shots at him at his back.
In 2019, after serving 5 years in prison, Borello was released on supervised release to the anger and dismay of his robbery victims. Despite the government's praise for his cooperation, his transition back into society was anything but smooth. Rather than lay low and avoid drawing attention to himself, Borello began making appearances on podcasts and YouTube shows where he openly lied about his violent past and seemed to revel in the notoriety that came with being a former mobster. One of the most prominent platforms Borello appeared on was The Johnny and Gene Show, a short-lived podcast he co-hosted with John Elite, another former mobster turned cooperator. Together they recounted stories of their time in organized crime, often discussing the brutal realities of their criminal lives with a sense of nostalgia that some found unsettling. However, Borello's participation in these shows violated the terms of a supervised release, which prohibited him from associating with known felons or engaging in activities that glorified his criminal past. In February of 2021, Borello was arrested after making death threats against his ex-girlfriend and her family over the phone, but got out nearing the end of June.
I'm gonna fucking murder you, bitch. You watch. You fucking piece of shit. You fucking scumbag. You do that to me. You a fucking piece of shit, bro.
Because you're wearing Ric Flair's stolen jewelry and I told them?
That's not. You're a
It
fucking
is.
piece of shit, bro. You're a fucking piece
So
of
now
shit.
you're threatening to murder me.
You're a fucking piece of shit. I did not to you. What the fuck is wrong with you, bro? How do you do that to somebody you
On February 9, 2023, Borello was arrested for violating the conditions of his release. His attempts to defend his actions by pointing out that other former mobsters like Sammy Gravano had been allowed to discuss their criminal pasts publicly did little to sway the court. The judge overseeing Borello's case reminded him that his participation in these shows had undermined the trust the court had placed in him when he was granted supervised release. Upon his release, Borello returned to the Howard Beach area, where he was chased out by an angry resident on camera. He is still in and out of jail for parole violations to this day. In 2020, as the COVID-19 pandemic swept through the United States, Azzaro's legal team filed for his compassionate release, citing his advanced age and deteriorating health as reasons for his release from prison. The pandemic presented a significant threat to older inmates, especially those with pre-existing conditions like Azzaro's. Also affected with the COVID pandemic behind bars was Michael Padavona. After his release, Azzaro returned to New York, where he lived out his final years in relative obscurity. On October 22nd, 2023, Azzaro passed away at the age of 86. His death marked the end of a long and tumultuous career in organized crime. He'd managed to evade conviction for most of his major crimes, and spent the majority of his life a free man out in the streets, despite what the feds tried. Azzaro's nephew, Jal Lanzo, now allegedly suffering from cancer, was released into New York halfway house in May of 2025, where he continues to reside until his parole is over.